This video has an absolute treasure trove of information. It's a long one, I know, but very much worth it, so please bear with me. Earlier this year, I discovered an atheist YouTube channel called Deconstruction Zone, run by a guy named Justin. He also has a more active channel called DZ Debates, where his debates are posted. I'll put links to all of his social media in the description below, and I'll also put them on the screen right now. I'm extremely impressed with him because he knows the Bible and the history of it so well that he is anxious to talk to anybody who disagrees with him about it. And that's what he does on his channels. He takes calls from theists who want to argue with him about the Bible, or sometimes more generally argue about the existence of God. And I've never seen anybody able to hang with him. He's basically a savant who has the whole Bible memorized. And not only that, but he was a pastor for many years and has a master's in divinity, and he knows the historical context behind each verse. He knows the languages they were written in. He has extensively studied the earliest manuscripts, and he knows problematic translations with individual words. When theists argue with him, he already knows what they're going to say before they say it. He already knows which verses they're going to cite. He knows their arguments better than they do, and he can argue for them better than they can. And of course, he can completely tear them apart using facts and knowledge. If you want to argue for the existence of God with a guy like that, and the God you're arguing for is the God of the Bible, and your knowledge is limited to what a specific version of the Bible says, or what you hear at church, and maybe your social media echo chamber, then you're not even coming to a gunfight with a knife. You're coming to a carpet bombing empty-handed.
Yeah, but it's the historical accuracy of the Bible that backs it up.
The Bible's not historically accurate. So just to be clear,
there's never been
you can't name a single one of the 500 people because they're not named. It's just a claim from 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Paul doesn't name a single one of them, and nobody ever went back to verify his claim because he was writing to people outside of Judea. Number two, Jesus didn't fulfill a single messianic prophecy, not one. He's at a record of exactly 0.
He fulfilled over 350 of them.
You want to put a bet on it?
Yeah, I do actually.
Sure, I'll Venmo you $100 if you can find me even one of them.
Even one of the... You want me to go grab my Bible right now? You want to see the messianic prophecies that Jesus Christ fulfilled himself?
Yeah, do it. You got $100 on the line, buddy.
Okay, what about off the top of my head? Say that again?
I said you got $100 on the line. Go ahead and find your Bible.
No, I have my Bible right here.
All right.
I can tell you right now.
Sure you can.
There's hundreds of them. Like, where do you want to start? Crucified with malefactors pierced through his hands and feet.
The number's at 0. So give me your favorite one, and we'll start there.
I would say my favorite is from the book of Isaiah, where it says that we will be healed by
chapter 53. How do you not know that chapter 53 is where that's at? It's crazy. Good Christian. Fantastic. So
you want to claim that
why would
I? You want to claim that there's 0?
Well, it is 0, and if you stop crashing out, you'll understand why the number's at 0 right now. So right now, the number's at 0, and you think Isaiah 53 is going. You think Isaiah 53 is going to be number 1. It's going to be number 0 in the list of fulfilled prophecies. Why would I believe that Isaiah 53 is about Jesus when the prophet clearly tells you that the nation of Israel is a servant? Have you read all of Isaiah, or did you only read chapter 53?
He was pierced through his hands and feet. This was written in Isaiah 800 years before.
No, it's not written in Isaiah. That's Psalm 22, and it's not a prophecy, and it doesn't say pierced.
It doesn't say pierced.
No, Psalm 22 verse 16 does not say pierced, and it's not written in Greek. Genius, it's written in Hebrew.
I said from the Coney Greek to the Hebrew Aramaic.
Right? It's not written in Koine Greek. It's written in Hebrew. Psalm 22 is a Hebrew psalm, And what's the Hebrew word for pierce? It's dakar. Doesn't show up in Psalm 22. What you find is ka'ri, which means like a lion, which is why better translations say like a lion rather than pierced.
Okay, so what about the other 350 prophecies?
There are 0. Name every one. I'll tell you why he didn't fulfill them.
Yeah, let's start from Genesis, right?
Genesis 3:15 is about a snake.
Says, I will put enemy between the woman and between thy seed and her seed, and it shall bruise thy head and bruise his heel. And in Galatians 4:4, this is fulfilled. When there's a fullness from the time to come, God sent forth his son and made a woman and made under the law.
That's adorable. Go back to verse 14. Read 14 real slowly. What's it say? Or just run. Fuck, I guess he didn't want the money. Okay, well.
I want people like Justin to have a bigger presence on the internet than I do. Fortunately, I was able to get Justin to come onto my channel so that I could interview him, which is what this video is. It's reassuring to know someone that competent already knows who I am and likes what I do, so that made it easier to lure him here where I could challenge him on the topic of biblical prophecies. Now, the reason I chose to focus on prophecies is because those are extremely compelling to believers in God. People say that the Bible has hundreds of fulfilled prophecies. The Gospels are full of claims that Jesus fulfilled this prophecy and that prophecy. And that's how you know it's true. And that's very compelling to a lot of believers. Let me show you a YouTube short that I recently saw that is typical of how believers perceive biblical prophecies.
25% of the Bible is prophecy. 25% of the Bible is telling the future. About 60 major prophecies telling you about when Jesus would be born, where he would be born, to whom he would be born. Okay, this has already happened. They were written in advance, prophesying of his birth. Peter Stoner, who is an expert from MIT, a statistician, he said the odds that one man's birth would fulfill even 8 prophecies. Okay, he fulfilled over 300, 60 major ones, but that one man would fulfill only 8 prophecies, the odds is 1 in 100 trillion. If I was to put 100 trillion silver dollars over the state of Texas, they would be 2 feet deep over the entire state of Texas. Now, if I marked one of those silver dollars and I buried it in San Antonio or Amarillo or in Dallas or in rural Texas near Tyler or something like that, and you walked around Texas and you reached deep down in those silver dollars and you grabbed the one I marked, the odds that you, on your first try, would grab the one I marked would be 1 in 100 trillion. And he's saying that's the odds that one man would fulfill 8 of those prophecies, and he fulfilled over 300. Do you see how trustworthy the scripture is? There's no other book like it.
They love coming up with odds, don't they? The more ridiculous, the better. They love making up numbers for how unlikely it was for the universe to come into existence, to how unlikely it would be for all those prophecies to be fulfilled. Yet it happened anyway. Pretty compelling, right? Well, Justin would look you in the eye and tell you that not one single biblical prophecy has been fulfilled. Astounding, crazy, absurd, right? Well, go ahead and challenge him on it. Be my guest. Pick your favorite prophecy or the most obscure prophecy you can think of, and he'll already be very familiar with it. He'll tell you the history, the context, how it was translated down to individual word choice, and most importantly, why it either was not fulfilled or why it's not even a prophecy. And that's what this video is about. I went through tons of alleged prophecies, and because we can't really go through all of them in a single video, I picked out the more popular or important ones and challenged Justin to answer for them. If you're interested in just jumping to a particular prophecy, check the timestamps of this video for it. Otherwise, I suggest going for a walk or finding something to do while listening to this, and learn from Justin about how the Bible was made and what that really entails. It's really fascinating, and just goes to show how truly far people have been misled about it, to the point of shaping entire national trajectories based on deceptions and misconceptions. It really makes me wonder how different things could be if not for the enormity of the setbacks caused by people's misguided beliefs.
One of the ones I talk about a lot is the punishment that was handed down to David for the Bathsheba incident. And
Right.
it's a very effective story in helping people understand that he's not just allowing bad things to happen, he is specifically causing them to happen.
That's one of the things that, honestly, ever since I started watching you, which was, I would say, this year, and I've watched a lot of your stuff since then, like, and it always, I don't know, I find it shocking when people try to justify some of these things, and it's just because it's like they have a side that they picked, and they have to defend it no matter what, no matter how horrific it is, and they have to justify it. And a lot of these people, what really surprises me is that they don't know the book, like, not nearly as well as you do. And but yet they've ideologically committed themselves to something that they don't know, they don't understand, and yet they're determined to defend it. And it's the most awful stuff you could imagine.
It's pretty bad.
Yeah. And what do you think causes someone to do that, where they're defending something they don't even know about?
I think a lot of it is when you grow up in a society where everybody is like, they believe the one thing, it feels like common knowledge. It's hard for people
Mhm.
to shake this idea that something that all of us believe could just be wrong. It's weird though when you sink into it, because if you're just saying like, well, the collective knows better than the individual. Well, there's like larger collectives around the world, like two-thirds
Yeah.
of the world don't believe in the religion, right? So it's a nonsensical thing. But when you don't know much about the world, and you haven't left I grew up in a little podunk town, you haven't left your hometown, it could just seem like that's what everyone believes, and it must be true because look at all these smart people, they believe it. But the other thing too is there's certainly like a sunken cost fallacy where they've
Yeah.
dedicated a lot to it, and they're like, well, I mean, certainly it must, if it's wrong, I've wasted all this time and I can't just give up on it. Like I have to fight until there's nothing to fight for, or else I've wasted all this time. And then I think maybe the third category of people are what I would say, like my mother. My mother was like a true believer for a long time, still mostly is. And
Mhm.
she looks at some of these situations and she's like, yeah, God's an asshole. What are you going to do about it? I was like, but for her, it's fear. She's like, she's literally afraid that this God is actually real and you cannot question it.
I don't envy their position. Let's put it that way. As somebody who has never been religious myself, I can't. It's difficult for me to empathize with that. But I really respect people like you who were believers, devout believers, and just through being, honest with yourself and researching, looking into it. Like a lot of these people that you talk to just haven't looked into it enough.
Mm.
And what surprises me about you is that you already know what they're going to say before they say it. You know the verses they're going to use. Um, you can recite the verses that they're looking for. They're probably still looking for it on their computer. Meanwhile, you could just recite them off the top of your head. And I'm thinking to myself, why can't they do that if they believe in it so much? I mean, that's the way I think I would be if this was something where like my eternal soul is on the line, I would know this stuff inside and out. The only reason I don't is because I don't believe it. I mean, I think I still, as as much as I do know, I think it's more than most believers. Not, not your scholars, obviously, but um, and that's just through my channel, because of what I do. But here's something that I didn't really know until started watching you more, was that it's not just modern day believers who don't know what they're talking about when it comes to scripture. I was surprised to learn that like the gospel authors a lot of the times didn't know what the hell they were talking about either.
That's the hardest part, yeah.
That surprised me because I always just assumed, well, they're citing scripture, they knew the scripture, but watching you, uh, you're showing how they got things wrong a lot of times.
Jesus himself really
Yeah.
bungles the Hebrew Bible. In fact, there's a famous passage where he's near the cleansing of the temple where he quotes Psalm 8, verse 2, and it's clearly from the Greek Septuagint. And this is one of those famous
Mm,
passages where the Greek Septuagint did some really funny stuff with the Hebrew text. And it's a really well-known, I don't want to say it's necessarily a discrepancy, but most people would call it a discrepancy, right? So most biblical scholars know that the Greek version of Psalm 8, verse 1 and 2 is drastically different than the Hebrew. So they typically wouldn't quote the Greek, but Jesus just does. Like that's the authoritative quotation, which is wild
mhm.
that you would think, the Son of God, an actual Jewish rabbi, he can't seem to quote the Hebrew Bible ever. He's always quoting this Greek Septuagint, even portions not only that aren't great translations, but also he kind of misunderstands what's happening even in the Greek text, which is odd to me. It seems, and this is my assessment, that the Jesus character in these Gospels, it has to be at least part fiction. It's hard for me to believe
Mm,
that there was a real Jewish rabbi in ancient Israel that just couldn't read Hebrew and Aramaic. It's preposterous.
right. How do other scholars handle stuff like that, who
Mm.
who are believers?
So my experience with scholars is most of them are maybe more agnostic than people realize. Unless you went to a
Mhm,
fundamentalistic school like a Bob Jones University or Roberts or Liberty. Well, Liberty's getting less fundamentalistic, but or some of the reformed seminaries can be really strict. But if you go to like a decent seminary, you'll find a lot of the professors are pretty open to like the
mm,
idea that the Bible, will have discrepancies, or that the interpretive model is it's pretty fast and loose with how the New Testament is using the Old Testament. And so because
mhm,
of that, the professors aren't usually as strict as like the pastors out there preaching, because they kind of know the problems, but they're willing to, like, a lot of them, they either grew up in the faith or they had maybe personal experiences. And so a lot of them are willing to kind of default on, like, well, I know there are problems. However, Jesus has made my life such a huge thing that, like, I won't abandon Jesus, even if I feel like there might be some issues in the text. Or like, I had a professor at seminary who, when covering the book of Daniel, was just really matter of fact, explaining when it was written, how scholars know it was written in the 2nd century for the most part, and why
mhm,
it's really not a disputed thing within the scholarly circles. The book of Daniel is just a 2nd century work, mostly about the Antiochian crisis. But the Christian interpretation would only work if that weren't the case, right? So, but
right.
what they can't tell you in class, they're not going to say, well, listen, the way Christians are reading this is just wrong. They're going to try to give you the information and then kind of move on and let you think for yourself what to make of it.
I
But
see.
these same professors as well, though, would be very well, they wouldn't take like the book of Daniel to be like, a real authoritative prophecy about Jesus. They would still, hold the book of Daniel in high regard and think that, well,
Mhm,
Jesus's form and function still exists, even if the book of Daniel isn't, interpreted correctly by most Christians. So it's just they find somewhere in the middle to land usually, and sometimes they go really liberal, and sometimes they say somewhat conservative. But most of the professors I've experienced through Bible college and seminary are pretty chill with having alternative interpretive models, admitting that there are ambiguities and problems in the text, and even admitting that, like, a lot of the way Christians interpret the Bible would be wrong. So, like, I had a New Testament professor when we did our first New Testament class in seminary. The thing you do in seminary a lot is you write exegesis papers. So, like, your first semester, they're teaching you a lot of interpretive models and how to write exegesis papers. But one thing that they'll joke about, and it's true, it wasn't just where I went. They'll joke about like the appropriate method of doing proper exegesis is always context. Context is always king. But when you read the New Testament, the problem you have is the way the New Testament uses the Old Testament. They take almost everything out of context. So I actually had a professor once that says, when we're doing exegesis papers, giving instructions, he said, if you use the same exegetical model as the New Testament authors, you're going to get an F. But it's just true. It's like, these are, I don't want to say they're open secrets, like all the stuff I talk about on my stream, I think they're pretty well known in seminaries and the academic circles. It's just that you can't tell your church members because they would leave, they would walk away. Their foundation, they would say in seminary, isn't strong enough to handle the difficult truths. And so when you're in the seminary, people will say about particular topics that this topic will stretch you or this topic will challenge you. And what they really mean to say is, hey, what you learned about this actually isn't true. And here's what scholars actually say. And it's up to you to figure out what to do with it. They won't tell you what to do with it. And that's, to be fair, last thing I'll say about, if you go to a good seminary, they're not going to tell you what to think. They're going to give you as much academic rigor and training as they can. And they're going to say, now this is your task to wrestle with and figure out what to do with it. Because, you don't go through all the education just to be told what to think.
Right. Yeah, that's probably the best way. I mean, you'd probably draw some suspicion if you tried to tell people how to interpret things. And I mean, that's why we're suspicious of, the church in the first place, or these apologists, that are trying to do these interpretations for us. The gospel writers, they didn't have a unified book to defer to, right? Like the Old Testament as we know it wasn't compiled yet, right? So
it was tough. Yeah. So
right.
There were like less formal Old Testament canons, or Hebrew Bible canon. So you find already, like, in the time of Philo, that there were talks about like which books were kind of authoritative and which ones weren't. This was one of the things that were upsetting to the rabbis. In fact, you'll see in the Talmud, they've got very harsh words to say about the Greek Septuagint. And one of those issues is that it seems like the people who were reading the Greek Septuagint had a slightly more lenient number of books that they were treating as authoritative. And we see this in the Qumran collection. If you look at the type of books that were popular at Qumran, you've got books like Enoch and stuff like that, which wasn't really like the authoritative leaders in Jerusalem wouldn't have held those books as high in esteem as the Christians, or the early Christians, the Jews of the time period. But there was no strict canon. There was nothing in place saying this is absolutely the only books that are authoritative. But certainly by the turn of the first century, after Jesus had already died, they were starting to have that conversation about, hey, we actually do need to put some limits out here so that there is some kind of a guide. And Christians will say, well, the Jews only did that in response to Jesus. And they wanted to erase Jesus. Like Justin Martyr goes through a dialogue explaining that the reason why the Jews don't accept the apocryphal books is because they so clearly predicted Jesus. So they had to remove them from the Hebrew canon. And so that's kind of, there was a tussle there in the first century BC and the first century CE about, hey, which books are actually in? But there were some core books. So the Torah was universally accepted. The Samaritans, a lot of times, didn't accept anything beyond the Torah, and that's why we have the sect of the Sadducees. They traditionally held mostly to the Torah, and so they didn't believe in an afterlife. They didn't believe in the messianic prophecies and things like that. And that's why you'll see the Sadducees questioning Jesus in the Bible about topics related to the afterlife. But there's not, as you say, there's not a cohesive viewpoint around the time of Jesus as to exactly which books we're going to allow And, who is actually in control of that? It took a little bit of a catastrophe with Rome and the Christians to sort of put the fire underneath some people's feet to say, hey, we actually have to tie these loose ends up.
Right. And that was another thing that surprised me more recently in my studies. I read Francesca Stavrakopoulou, and talking about how this concept of the afterlife as we know it, with the heaven and the hell and the reward and the punishments, or that was not really a thing until the Christians came along. Well, I mean, it was in other cultures, but that it was an influence from the Babylonian captivity.
So the rise of the afterlife is one of those interesting things in the Hebrew culture, where there absolutely was a period where what they believed happened after death just doesn't match what's in the Bible. So in the Bronze Age, they did practice a lot of ancestor worship. They believed that, your ancestors, not everyone believed this, but your ancestors would depart, their soul would go down to Sheol. That's one of the reasons why they had a habit of, if you had a cave at the foot of a mountain, that was a prime location for resting people's bones, because they believed that a lot of the caves, if you go deep enough into them, they would lead down into Sheol. And there's some passages in Enoch and also in the Bible that kind of allude to this idea. So, but the general idea was they could have a passageway between Sheol and the upper world through the cave quite often, and you can leave votive offerings. So you'll find in a lot of these Bronze Age, even Hebrew burial chambers, you'll find votive offerings and gifts and things that they could perhaps use in the afterlife, just like we would find in Egyptian tombs. But that did shift over the course of time. Once, I would say, the religion became more Yahwistic, you see a lot less of that. And you get this idea in the post-Babylonian period of hey, God did kind of promise that he would restore us, and then it didn't happen. How are we supposed to reconcile this? And so they start shifting to this idea of, well, actually, after you die, at the end of all things, there would be a resurrection, of those righteous people that God will vindicate. Daniel 12 is probably one of the first and most clear passages to address it, where, after the Archangel Michael kind of grants victory to the people, it says the dead of the earth will rise, some to everlasting life and some to everlasting shame and contempt. But this is already the 2nd century. It took all the way to the 2nd century to get to that type of a viewpoint. And the only other time you see it, like this resurrection business, is in Isaiah. There's a mention in Isaiah, and it's ambiguous. It could be referring to, say, the resurrection of the nation as a nation. It could be referring to the resurrection of the righteous, the individuals, but it's a little bit ambiguous. It's not until the 2nd and 1st century, when all the promises and all the prophecies are just not working, that they get forced to go back and reinterpret them and really build up this idea of, no, God hasn't forgotten his promises. God hasn't forgot about us. This is what's going to happen. And one of the reasons why they could do that is because they were borrowing from the Persian culture, the Hellenistic culture, and then eventually even Roman culture. But in Persian culture, Zoroastrianism, and also in Greek culture, there was this idea that you could perhaps go down to Sheol or Hades, and there are occasions in which you could be risen up out of the place. And so why wouldn't you adopt that? If you can reinterpret your Hebrew scriptures in light of these, facts, and make it all cohesive and give hope to your people, sure, you would want to bring that interpretive model to your people rather than your people die of despair.
Yeah, I do get the impression from the earlier scriptures that Yahweh was more of his what defines Yahweh seemed to change. Like, he used to be a guy in a physical place who didn't know everything, and who could be surprised or disappointed or regretful. And along the way, he was made into that, it's like some kid saying, my superhero has all these powers now, like to defeat all these other gods. But it seemed to not be the case in the early days, to me anyway, reading the Bible.
No, you're 100% correct. The earliest versions of God in the Bible, and this is one of the reasons people will say, like, well, all of the Old Testament was written like in the exile or post-exile, but that's not really true. Some of the depictions of God, for example, in Genesis and Exodus, really only match the culture of the Bronze period. So in like the late Bronze Age, they still had this idea that gods lived on mountains. They had bodies. They would come down to visit men through the mountains. That's why they built ziggurats. The ziggurats were man-made mountains. That's why they would call the ziggurats names like the gateway between heaven and earth, or the stair step of the gods. Different things like that, because the gods were just up there, and they ate and they drank up there, right? So if you read the Baal cycle from the Ugaritic literature, the gods would have drinking parties. They'd get together and have feasts. And there was one where in one of the banquets, El, the supreme god, gets drunk, and like he soils himself, is the right way to say it. And they have to like take care of him because he's so, he's drunk and passed out and whatnot. So, but this was the ancient conception of the gods. Like you said, they were very superhuman-like. They weren't this, traditional philosophical, non-material type of transcendent being. And there's a great book on this particular topic. I recommend it a lot to my audience. Is by Esther Hamori. She's probably more popular right now because she wrote a book called God's Monsters, but one of her first works was called When Gods Were Men, and it's phenomenal. It covers this particular topic very, very well.
Yeah, that would be very interesting. The notion of God's nature, did that evolve because of problems, like logical problems that people found with this idea of God being more human-like?
A little bit, yeah. So you can see unfortunately, we don't have as many ancient manuscripts as we would like, but even in the manuscripts we have, what we can find is, the Yahwistic God, meaning the God that was in the Hebrew Bible that was more or less like the Judean version of God. The Northern Israelites, we would have referred to them as the Elohists. But this Judean version of God was a little bit human-like. He would come down, he would eat, so in like Genesis 18, he eats with Abraham. And so what we find later in scribal history, this kind of made some of the people uncomfortable. So you'll find insertions where rather than saying Yahweh did X, Y, or Z, it would say the angel of Yahweh did X, Y, or Z. And so there certainly seems to be a shift of like, we need to make our God less human-like. And some of the dirty things that humans get up to, we got to distance God from that just a little bit. And even the famous passage when David takes the census, well, in Samuel, it says that God incited David. In Chronicles, which was written hundreds of years later, it says that Satan incited David because, again, they're trying to reform the image of God. And so this happens quite a bit. One of the reasons why it seems to happen, and if you're not familiar with ancient Near East, this was kind of a phenomenon that happened in the Near East where when you had little city-states and the gods were like dedicated to a city or a small region, you could have a god that was localized. It wasn't a big deal. But once you got these giant geopolitical nations like the Neo-Assyrian Empire that was going to go and wipe out the entire Levant, all of a sudden you've got gods that need to be bigger than just your geographical little location. And so we find a big shift in this time period of like the gods that were kind of supreme in the pantheons, or at least high up in the pantheons, they start getting pushed up into this role where actually you shouldn't worship all the gods. This is the God you really need to worship. Everybody else is kind of subordinate to them. So this will be like a version of henotheism. And certainly Judaism took that form. It went from kind of regional deity, well, technically two of them. Eventually that got merged into one. I would read Mark S. Smith on this. And then eventually, though, that even that merged regional deity needed to become bigger because what happened to the Israelites? They got taken captive. They're gone. Well, how's God going to act? How's God going to save his people when they're not even here anymore? They're way over there. Well, now your God needs to be big. He needs to be able to go over to their territory and mess those guys up and bring them back. So the notion of God has to become bigger in order for God to do what you need God to do. And so that's kind of how that worked. And then, as time goes on, once you get to the point where like, well, actually our God is superior over all of the gods. Well, how could that be? how could your God be superior over all the gods? Well, that could only be is if he had different unique properties that they didn't have. Namely, he could be, omnipresent, or he might be maximally present, something like that. And so you'll see that shift throughout the Hebrew Bible. You see God going from a regional, corporeal deity, even up into the time of Ezekiel, and to where he seems to be like everywhere. Like in Jeremiah, there's a passage where he basically says, "Does my presence not fill the entire earth?" Well, that's not something we would have expected in the Bronze Age, but it is kind of something we'd expect during I would say, the exilic and post-exilic phase, when they needed God to be bigger and stronger and mightier. Or else, how could God fulfill any of those huge promises that he had already made?
Right, right. And it seems like much later, with scientific advancements, it seemed like they had to keep pushing God back. He's beyond space and time, spaceless, timeless, causeless, and it just, I don't know. It just seems like the idea of God had to keep changing. Maybe it'll be different 100 years from now when we discover more about the universe, and they'll have to adjust.
Right.
But it seems like an ever moving goalpost that
It's
you'll
true.
never be able to disprove, because they'll just change the definition, really.
Yeah. Well, in Christian circles, like even when I was in school, they would refer to this type of thing as like progressive revelation, meaning God didn't reveal everything about himself all at once. It was really progressive, but
Right.
it draws a problem, which is like, okay, well, it seems like this later information doesn't agree with the previous information. Like, it's not that we have new revelations, that we have contradicting revelation, right? So progressive is not the word I would put on it. I would say that they changed their notions of God, or like the nature of God, you said, because they needed to fix problems. And so
right.
what do? You make small tweaks here, small tweaks there over the course of a long period of time, because you're like, oh, here's a problem, let's fix it. But you do that for 800 years, and now you've got a God notion that's quite a bit different than what you started out with.
Yeah, and that brings me to the people you talk to, the theists that you talk to online. And when you ask them things about what they would do if God told you to kill a baby, and they say things like, well, God wouldn't do that. And you point out, well, the Bible, it says he has done that. Well, he won't do that now. It's like, well, now you're advocating this moral relativism that you claim to be against. And it just seems like they have this immense level of cognitive dissonance where, they think God is a certain way, and they're kind of relying on this idea that, God allowed slavery back then because, that was part of their culture. And it's like, well, that always seemed so weird to me that God would be against something, but then allow it because it's what the people wanted to do. That seems very antithetical to the God I hear about today. He doesn't say, well, this is how you have to masturbate, even though I don't approve of it.
Right.
But he does say that about slavery.
Right.
This is how I want you to do slavery. It doesn't make sense to me.
It's weird too, because, and this is where Christians go wrong, and people who watch my stream are probably familiar with some of these passages, but there's quite a few passages where God flat out says that you will follow this law code forever. All the days that you live on the earth, you being the Jewish people, or the Hebrew people at the time. And the New Testament says, in Acts chapter 15, there's like this speech about how the law was too much to bear even for our forefathers. But in Deuteronomy 30, verse 11, God says, actually, this law is not too hard for you, nor is it too far away that someone should say, go and get it for me. And in the same chapter, if you go back in Deuteronomy 30, God literally says through Moses that there's this time period that you might be familiar with. It's in the New Testament where the hearts of the people get circumcised and they become like spiritual children of Abraham. And then finally, they're going to love the Lord with all their mind, heart, and soul and whatnot. Well, this pops up in Deuteronomy 30, and which you would expect, because Deuteronomy 30 was written roughly at the time of Jeremiah. Jeremiah talks about this time period, so does Ezekiel chapter 36. So this idea that, hey, there's this eschatological end period when God is finally going to do the thing. He's going to circumcise people's hearts, and then they're going to do all the stuff God wanted. They're not going to be disobedient. They're going to love God finally. And then you just go from verse 6 to verse 8, and it says, oh, also, when this happens, you're going to follow all of these commandments that I'm giving you today. Oh, interesting. You mean that's even in the eschatological end period, they're going to be following these Mosaic laws? Gotcha. And so when Jesus says in Matthew 19 that this wasn't God's intention, the law of divorce, he's referring to Deuteronomy 24, the law of divorce, where a man can give a writ of divorce to his wife. And then that's really not what it's about. It's actually about not taking her back if you keep reading, because he'll defile the bed. But the thing of it is Jesus is like, he did something really interesting. He knew there was a contradiction in Malachi. Malachi, God says, I hate divorce. It's not a true contradiction. But Jesus, like, actually, he needs a way to soften some of this language. And he obviously didn't know the Hebrew Bible that well, but he must have known about Malachi. And he's like, actually, that wasn't God's intention from the beginning. In fact, he only gave it because of the hardness of your hearts. And then Christians say, oh, well, all the laws are like that. All the laws we don't like, we're just going to do that. We're going to do that with it. But you can't do that with every law you don't like. Jesus only got away with that one time because there was a contradiction of sorts in the Bible. And if you were reading it, you'd be led to believe, hey, why did God say that you can get divorced when over here he says he actually hates divorce? What's going on there, right? But you can't just apply that to every single law that you don't like. But it's also true that that would be basically just a contradiction. You actually can't fix that contradiction, because if God says that by doing these laws, you'll be doing what is good and right in the sight of the Lord your God, that's Deuteronomy 12:28, and he says that you got to do this forever, that means that Jesus's reading of Deuteronomy 24 is just wrong. He's flat out wrong. He has to ignore the exact words of Yahweh throughout the book of Deuteronomy to get to that conclusion.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that surprised me so much, was that the authors of the Bible got previous books in the Bible wrong, just like people do today. So and you hear over and over again about how the Bible is inerrant. There's no contradictions. It's a bragging point. 66 books across 1,500 years, no mistakes, and there's tons of mistakes.
So many.
It's shocking that people can say that. Let me. Can I throw some prophecies at you? So people.
It's my favorite topic, and I think you already know that. This is the topic most near and dear to my heart, because honestly, and I know people love talking about the resurrection, but if all these prophetic fulfillments are just copes and lies, I don't care if the guy rose from the dead or not. He's absolutely not the Messiah.
As far as the resurrection goes, the main argument that comes up over and over and over again is that all these guys would have died for a lie, and I looked into all the the historical records that were that supposedly record their executions, and most of them come from the apocryphal, the apocrypha texts, and there's a lot of contradictory. Some of them are killed at wildly different ways into completely different countries. There's all kinds of strange supernatural claims, and there's all these accounts are just so bizarre. Or they're telling the Romans how they want to be executed. I want to be executed upside down. I want to be executed this way. It's like, this doesn't sound like. Are they taking order? Were the Romans taking orders, for executions?
No, and you're right. They're in these stories. They're ludicrous. Like in the apocryphal Acts of Peter, that's the one where he gets crucified upside down. Well, most Christians, if you ask them how was Peter crucified, that he was absolutely crucified upside down, because church tradition teaches it. It's a fact. Okay, the same book that teaches that also said that there was a dog that was given the power of speech in order to dress down Simon Magus, and that there was a baby suckling at his mother's teat that also gave a speech to a crowd. And then later, Simon Magus has a wizard's duel with Peter, and he's flying through the air. So, I mean, if that's the type of credibility that we want to say is historical, I mean, I'm at a loss for words.
Yeah. Which one was it who wasn't killed, but there is the account that they were boiled alive in a vat of oil?
Yeah,
in front of a crowd. John, yeah. And then they couldn't kill him, so they had to exile him, right?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of, in early church history, there's a lot of stuff about John's death and supposed death. It seems like the early church, while there were these legendary accounts, there was a lot of people in the early church that was like, yeah, there's some fairy tale accounts going on here.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, what I say is not who would die for a lie, but who would lie about a death. And obviously
Right.
that was happening because there's many different stories for each one. So
Mhm.
obviously at least some of them can't be true. Some of these stories don't even have anything to do with dying for their beliefs. It's because they pissed off a king, you know,
Right.
and that's so that all gets uh consolidated into this argument. Oh, they were persecuted and martyred. But even even the stories they would cite don't say that. A lot of them.
It's true. And the other thing too is, the persecution and the martyr doesn't actually validate the story. So we've got martyrs in all the religions. We got early Islamic martyrs, we've got early Mormon martyrs. Most of the
Hmm.
religions, when they started, had some kind of martyrs. In fact, we've got lots of Jewish martyrs, even from the same time period. Martyrdom, I don't
Hmm.
think, is a hallmark sign that what somebody believes is true. But the other problem too is, like, there were martyrs after the disciples for hundreds of years. Well, they didn't witness
Hmm.
anything, right? So if people who didn't witness anything are willing to give their lives, then that means the disciples could have been the same. The disciples who theoretically couldn't have witnessed anything may have been willing to give their lives. But my personal opinion is, I think there's probably one or a combination of two different things that happened. I personally believe in the not the minimal facts or the minimal witnesses approach that Apologia takes, although I love the minimal witnesses approach. But I kind of like the imposter approach. So in the ancient world, especially at this time period, it was very common for people to impostor somebody famous who had died and to convince
Hmm.
people that they were still alive. And some people even did it for themselves. Zalmoxis, a follower of Pythagoras, did this. And there were others, a number of people who claimed to have risen from the dead. And at that time period, there were quite a few people who claimed to have risen from the dead. So pretending that you were one of them wasn't all that uncommon. And even in the Gospels, if you go to the Olivet Discourse, like in Mark 13, we find that indeed Jesus says, "Many will come in my name and say that I am he," meaning after I die, there will be imposters. It's like the author is
Hmm.
trying to get ahead of it. And even Nero is obviously the target of Revelation 13 and the Mark of the Beast. And there's
Yeah.
a section in there where it talks about how he'll be revived of a mortal wound, meaning he came back to life after he was killed. And wouldn't you know it, in the first century, when he died in 68 AD, people largely believed that he had come back from the dead and was going to be returning to persecute the Christians and the Jews. And this went on for a very long time. Even as late as the 90s CE, there were still Nero imposters popping up that the Romans had to either imprison or execute. And one of them was incredibly successful. He convinced the Parthian military leaders that they needed to go to war with Rome because the resurrected Nero was leading the helm, and they were just going to march on in and put him back on the throne. And unfortunately, the rest of the story didn't get written down. So we don't actually know how that fell apart or what happened. But what we do know is that there were some very successful Nero imposters. And so I don't have a good reason. Like, if a guy can just pretend to be the resurrected Nero and convince a whole army to possibly go to war, I'm not all that
Yeah.
impressed by a guy who could, I don't know, convince one or two disciples that they're still alive and convince, the rest of the gang, which explains why in the New Testament so many people didn't recognize him. Mary Magdalene at the tomb and John didn't recognize him. The disciples on the road didn't recognize him. And even in Matthew 28, at the end of the gospel, after he had spent all that time with them as resurrected, they didn't even believe fully themselves. It said they still doubted, which, why would that be the case? It seems like if the gospel is preserving some memory, like authentic memory of something, it seems like the authentic memory is that after Jesus supposedly resurrected, people really weren't all that sure about it. And you would expect that
Hmm.
if it was just an imposter.
And speaking of the resurrected Nero, is that what inspired the book of Revelation?
Mm. I
That's what I've
mean,
heard, is that that it's coded language warning about the Romans.
Yeah, all Revelation. Most of the scholars I've ever encountered and read understand the book of Revelation to really be about the first century and the eschatological end battle with the Romans. Everything is coded to the Romans, and that's why Revelation 13 is so important. It's really easy to demonstrate that Revelation 13 is about Nero. This is not really something that scholars spend a lot of time debating. The gematria on 666 is Neron Kaiser. That's the nominal Greek ending of his name. And in the Latin manuscripts, you would see 616, which would be Latinized spelling of his name, which is what we say in English. We say Nero rather than Neron, and that's the Latinized version, and that's why it says 616 in those manuscripts, because the earliest authors understood that this was absolutely about Nero, and they needed to make sure that the numbers matched, so you knew it was about Nero.
Yet you have this enormous population of people who think that the book of Revelation is something that's going to happen soon, and that it spells the end of the world and the ushering in of, you know, the kingdom of heaven and all of that. And really, it's just coded language so that they wouldn't be caught talking about Rome and in a way they weren't supposed to back then.
You got it, yeah. And you can't say that if you're writing an apocalyptic literature and the enemy is the nation that's occupying you. You can't just say, oh, and then this is when God destroys Rome. You can't do that.
Right.
You have to call him something like your greatest enemy, Babylon.
Yeah. And so besides the resurrection, another thing that is very convincing to people are, and you'll hear it over and over again, you know, the Bible has 300 prophecies that have been ironclad fulfilled. More than that, but they like to cite, you know, 300 specific prophecies as being ironclad. Even like when I was in college, I did a speech class where we were allowed to give a speech of whatever we wanted. The subject could be whatever we wanted. And the first few students picked their religion to talk about their religion. So everyone took that idea, and the whole class ended up talking about their religions. It was, you know, like 2 students a day till everyone was done. And I was one of the last people, and I gave a speech about how all their religions are bullshit, which was hard. I mean, it was a very diverse class. There was Muslims and Christians, Jehovah's Witnesses, Catholics, and the question and answer period after that, I took everybody's time because people wouldn't stop with the questions. And one of them that kept coming up was, how do you explain all the fulfilled prophecies? And, you know, that's not something that you can get through in, you know, a half hour, 45 minutes, however much time I had to answer questions. It was supposed to be 15 minutes, but it went on for the rest of the class. And one of the answers I gave was covering the vague ones that, you know, wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and famines and, you know, stuff that go on all the time. But there's specific ones, and I've heard people bring this up with you. You know what they're going to say before they do. And like for like one of the first ones that I wrote down was Genesis 3:15.
Right. Yeah. Pretty classic.
Jesus' ministry will defeat the devil.
Right. Yeah. Presumably, this is the proto gospel, right? There's some problems with this, and I'm sure you know some of them. You only need like a careful reading to pick up on them. And I think, honestly, if you gave this to a small child, they'd probably know what's happening here because they haven't been brainwashed into reading Jesus into it. But in the passage, God's about to curse the snake. And keep in mind, in the story, it never says that the snake is Satan. That's something Christians have to put into it. It says, the serpent tricked me and I ate. The Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you among all animals and among wild creatures. Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. So if we pause there, the first question is, okay, who's he talking to? Well, obviously he's talking to a snake. And what did he just describe the snake to be? Oh, it's obviously a wild creature and one of the animals. So this is a legitimate snake. And you
Mhm.
might be inclined to say, okay, well, maybe Satan was inhabiting the snake. Well, you might be able to convince some people with that, but then you've got a bigger problem. Okay, well, if this is Satan that's just inhabiting a snake's body, why did actual snakes get cursed? Why did actual snakes lose their legs? Why were they cursed to live in the ground and eat the dirt of the ground? That wouldn't make sense if snakes themselves weren't actually the problem. And so
Yeah.
most scholars point out this is part of an etiology. This is explaining the relationship between snakes and humans. And this is somewhat expected. Snake culture in the ancient Near East was pretty wild. You had some, like Egypt, that like worship snakes, and you had even a couple Canaanite cults that were quasi snake worshippers. And then the rest of ancient Near East was like, nope, snakes are awful, they're evil, they're wily, tricky serpents, and they're like the enemy of mankind. And that's why you see the next verse, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. He will strike your head and you will strike his heel. Well, listen, anyone who's like seen ancient Near Eastern iconography or read any literature knows that if a snake comes up on you and you're traveling on the road, you got one of two choices. You're going to do a dance and step on his head, or you're going to run far and fast away from it. Those are about your only two options. When you step on their head, they're probably going to nip you. You might get bitten. That's kind of the trade-off, right? And the other problem here is it's obviously about snakes' offsprings. It says, I'll put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. Okay, well, this is interesting because Satan didn't have any offspring. And I realize Christians will say, well, you know, the people who do evil are like the spiritual children of Satan. But that's nonsensical, because this word doesn't refer to spiritual children. It just refers to literal seed. So zerah in Hebrew it does get translated to offspring very often, but it really just literally means the seed, like the sperm. So in like the Greek Septuagint, they would translate this to, sperma. And that's just, the genetic, material. They believed that the seeds of all humans would just be planted inside of a woman, and then it was like a garden, it would grow. And so there's not a good reason to read this passage and think like, oh, this is talking about spiritual children. How is Jesus stepping on the heads of the spiritual children of Satan? You mean just the non-believers? You think Jesus is stepping on the heads of the non-believers? Like, it's such a weird thing to envision if you just stop and think about it. But if you read this the way it should have been read, which is, hey, this is an explanation of why snakes and humans are kind of at odds with each other, because God created them to be tricksters. They're wily, they're cunning. And we find in the ancient Near East lots of stories about this type of thing. There's a story of an eagle and a snake where they're both trying to out-cun each other in duping each other to get what they want. There's the story of Gilgamesh, where a snake steals the plant of immortality from Gilgamesh, as he already, went to go find Utnapishtim to figure out how you can become immortal. He dives down through the sea of depth to get the plant. The sea of death, I mean. And then when he's on the shore, a serpent comes and takes his plant, and he never gets the immortal life. Another one, Nana and the Hupulu tree. She gets this divine tree, and she loves it. It's like a gift from the gods. And a snake burrows into the base of it and destroys the tree and takes her divine tree away from her. So we've got a bunch of these ancient Near Eastern images from Babylon that paint snakes as like these enemies of humans and destroyers of the divine. And wouldn't you know it, most of the first 11 chapters of Genesis are directly written to polemicize Babylonian literature.
Yeah. It's funny, a lot of the criticisms I get, throughout I've gotten throughout my life when I argue about the Bible is that, oh, no, you're taking this out of context, or you're taking that out of context. When I look at these prophecies, I see an awful lot of narrowing to specific passages where if you just widen the view a little bit and look at the context before, the passages before and after, it becomes very clear that it's not talking about Jesus. It's talking about something completely different.
Yeah.
And I just find that funny. There's the next group of prophecies would be in the Psalms.
Oh, yeah.
Right. There's tons of them in the Psalms. Psalm 16:10, about how Jesus won't decay.
Right. Yeah. Well, this is a classification of messianic psalms, or sometimes we call them golden psalms. where they take writings of King David and they're just like, oh, they're prophecies now, because there was something mentioned in there that reminds us of Jesus. So, as you said, this one's about not decaying, right? But like, David is literally just writing a psalm of blessing, of how God allowed him to live through the turmoil that he was experiencing. And if you read most of his psalms, a lot of his psalms are psalms of distress, and then also psalms of blessing. And so that's why he says, therefore my heart is glad, my soul rejoices, my body also rests secure. Why? Because he's safe. For you did not give me up to Sheol, or let the faithful one see the pit, or some will say corruption. And there is certainly some debate as to whether or not we should say like pit, Sheol, corruption. How do we translate this? But the reality is David is literally just saying, hey, you spared my life. You did not give me up to the grave. That's it. He's not saying that you're going to let me live forever. He's not saying that I'll never die. That's not what's being said here. But if you need something in the Hebrew Bible that talks about, hey, not decaying, this is something that could get you there if you just ignore all the context.
Yeah, it seems like out of the blue, it seems like just taking a section of a section and saying, oh, that applies to my guy, so that's what it is. When really the broader literature doesn't express that at all. Psalm 22 is another one. There's tons of verses in Psalm 22 that keep coming up about that are supposedly talking about Jesus.
Right. Psalm 22 is one of the most popular.
Yeah. It's, if you read through it, it's, I mean, and that one actually, in my opinion, it's not bad. It sounds like someone being crucified to me, right?
Well, Psalm 22 is one of those interesting ones because in general, I don't like to criticize the Bible translators because, first of all, I know a bunch of them. And the amount of time and dedication it takes to become a true Bible translator. Like I took Greek and Hebrew and some Akkadian when I was in school. And sure, can I translate some text? Absolutely. Am I a professional? Should I be on a board translating professional translations? No. These people doing translations are really, really smart. The problem that we have, though, is unfortunately, despite how smart they are, it's clear that they're also at times doing apologetics, and they're doing it on purpose. And so Psalm 22 is one such occasion, and they've been doing apologetics on this passage ever since the beginning of the church, because they really need this to be about Jesus. But the apologetic that is the problem is, if you go to verse 16, it says, dogs are all around me, a company of evildoers encircle me. My translation says they bound my hands and feet. I can count all of my bones, so on and so forth. Now, most translations that are of the older variety or the conservative variety will say something like, they pierced my hands and my feet. Well, that's interesting. Wonder why. That's a huge difference between piercing and binding. And then you'll find in the Masoretic tradition that it'll say, like a lion at my hands and my feet. Well, these are huge, huge differences. And the reality is, the word for pierced, the car, which shows up in Zechariah when it talks about the one who is pierced, that's a real way to say pierced. We don't find that here in the Hebrew text. And we don't even find it in the Greek text. In fact, the Greek text seems to match what the Aramaic and the Hebrew texts were typically saying, which is what the non-Christians would say. It's probably either they bound my hands and my feet or like a lion. And I can show you why, though, people came to this conclusion that perhaps it was piercing my hands and my feet, the Christian notion from the Hebrew text. And the reason why that is, there's a scroll. It's not technically part of the Dead Sea Scrolls like they found, but it's near. It's in the Judean desert, and I'll grab it for you real quick. I've got a picture of the document that will help kind of elucidate the situation. But there's a word in here that simply doesn't mean pierce, but it also doesn't mean like a lion. And you're like, okay, what's happening? So if you look at the very far right column, the Hebrew reads from right to left. The second word, the one in the middle, that looks like a backwards C, that's karu. Now, unfortunately, karu is not a word. It doesn't exist in the Hebrew language. It's either a spelling mistake or the very last letter got mistakenly elongated. That might be the right word to say for it. And so there's a letter in Hebrew called a yod, and one of the most common mistakes when copying Hebrew manuscripts is sometimes that yod will just the tail will get a little bit long. And then before you know it, they can't tell the difference between a yod and a a vowel. So, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. So what we've got in the yod is something kind of like that. But if you accidentally make it longer, you've got like a vav, which in this case, this is an actual vowel usage of the vav. It's very easy to make it too long. It happens on accident all the time. Well, it just happens to be that this word, karu, if in fact you take that vav and you shrink it back to a yod, it is a real word. That's a real actual word. It means like a lion, kari. And so
and it makes sense in the context.
Exactly, because animals are the ones that are attacking David metaphorically here. And the other thing is, if we assume it's another word, well, the only other word it could be is probably kara, and kara is not spelled this way. You wouldn't have an aleph as a second letter. But also the issue is that it would just mean to like dig, like with a shovel. Like you wouldn't get this piercing idea, right? And so these translations that say pierce, what they're saying, what they're trying to do is they're trying to say, listen, I don't know, digging at something could be interpreted to be similar to piercing. So we'll write pierced in there because we need this to be about Jesus, and then we'll call it a day. But a more honest Bible translation will spell this out for you. And on the last thing I'll say on this, if you want an honest look at this from a Bible translation, you can get the Net Bible with full notes. They sell it on Amazon, and there's a whole write-up in the Net Bible about this particular problem. And so if you want to know more about this, it's a very well-known problem. If you want to know more about this, I think the Net Bible is a great resource you can read. You don't have to know Greek or Hebrew to really grab a hold of what's going on here. So all that to say is the reason why all these translations differ is because the earliest manuscript that we have is obviously corrupted. Somebody made a huge goof, and we don't really know what they intended. And here's all the variants around the time of Jesus. So the Masoretic text says Ka'ari. The Aramaic Targum says Ka'ari, although that's the Aramaic spelling. And then we also have Ka'aru, they dug, which is the Dead Sea Scroll. And then they deface, Ka'aru. Interesting, Ka'aru and the word above it, Ka'aru, they sound identical. The only difference is the second letter. Both of them are silent, but they're drawn differently. However, one would mean they defaced, and one would mean they dug. And so it's interesting. We've got all these variants. And then the Greek, they couldn't figure it out either. The Greek translators like, we don't know what was the original. So we've got they dug, they disfigured, they burrowed, they bound, they sought to bound, or they sought to bind. And so the reality is, if your Bible says pierced here, they are simply doing apologetics, and they want you to think this is about Jesus when it simply isn't about Jesus. This is stock imagery of somebody who is being captured in battle. And what happened when you get captured in battle? They would take your clothing. They would surround you like a pack of animals. They would do a horrible torment to you. And we find this in all the biblical literature and in Josephus. In Josephus, it talks about the war with the Amalekites. After they were captured and killed, they went and stripped all the bodies of their belongings. We find it in like the treaties. There's a treaty between King Esarhaddon and Tyre, where in the blessing and cursing section at the end of it, they're like, hey, if you break this curse, in fact, it says in the curse, may Astarte break your bow in the thick of battle, and have you crouch at the feet of your enemy, and may a foreign enemy divide your belongings. This is just stock imagery of like, hey, if you're going to get captured, if you're going to go down in war, this is what's going to happen. They're going to beat you, they're going to torture you, and they're going to take all your stuff.
Yeah. So what happened to Jesus, not describing it as like a literal crucifixion. I mean, obviously that word isn't used, but the violence was not uncommon back then.
No.
People being pierced. Well, I mean, everyone's using swords and spears back then. Of course, there's going to be a lot of people getting pierced. So I don't know. To me, it doesn't seem that impressive to describe this and say, oh, they're obviously talking about Jesus, when you had, any number of people that this is happening to. There's all.
Yeah, for sure. Because even if you did put the word pierce in there, okay, cool. Let's talk about this. Okay, is there a reading of this passage that could get you to the conclusion that it's not about Jesus, it's about David? Yeah, of course. Are dogs literally surrounding him? No. Are lions literally surrounding him? No. Can he actually count all of his bones? No. These are not literal things that are happening. These are David using dramatic language to describe his struggles. And so if he says, they pierce my hands and my feet. Okay, that could certainly happen. That are things, those things did happen.
If a dog is biting you.
Yeah, well, right?
I mean, what causes people to take these writings, the things David wrote about his own life, and to assume that he was making a prophecy about Jesus? Why is it so remarkable that David would just be talking about his own life, or do they see it as like a real life form of foreshadowing?
So that's typically, if you talk to a professional, they're going to say something along those lines. They're going to say, listen, this is not actually originally about Jesus. So they would appeal to maybe a dual fulfillment, although this isn't a real prophecy. So they wouldn't say a dual fulfillment. They would say it's like typological. And so what they'll say, and believe it or not, all of the prophecies about Jesus are somehow in this category. Not a single one of them are about Jesus in the original context. Scholars know this. And so what they'll say is actually, these are like hidden in the text, right? So for example, we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls a trend called Pesher. We have a number of Pesherim. In fact, if you get a copy of the Dead Sea Scrolls, like this is a pretty recent edition. This is a really good one. But you'll find a number of writings in here referred to as Pesher. So they got the Pesher on Habakkuk, Pesher on Nahum. And what they're doing in these Pesher texts is they're saying, listen, we've got these texts in the Hebrew Bible. And unfortunately, God's not giving us any new writings. So we need to go in and reinterpret these things to be about us. And so you'll find exactly that. For example, in the Pesher here, this should be the one on Nahum. It says, wherever the lion goes to enter, there also goes the whelp without fear. And this is from Nahum 2. And now, if you know anything about Nahum, like, this is talking about the Babylonian period. And so it's interesting here, it's supposed to be about the destruction of Nineveh in chapter 2, but the Pesher says, this actually refers to Demetrius, king of Greece, who sought to enter Jerusalem through the council of flattery seekers. Wait, what? Greece? The chapter clearly told you that this was about the destruction of Nineveh. And so this is what they were doing. They were going in and say, listen, God is speaking through these texts to us. We have to decode them, right? We have to take your magic decoder ring and find out what God is really saying, because first of all, the promises can't fail, but also we don't have any new prophecies. We have to work with something, right? And so this is what the New Testament did with the Hebrew Bible. They went in and said, here's some stuff that if you squint just right and ignore the context, we can say that it's a coded message. It's a foreshadowing. It's a typological prophecy about our favorite guy, Jesus.
And do you think that they were being sincere when they did that, or they were just trying to force puzzle pieces together that didn't fit, and they knew what they were doing?
Yeah, I think it's a mixture of both, actually. There certainly were Jews in this time period who practiced this form of interpreting, and they legitimately believed it. And you'll find even Christians today. You'll find Christians that will believe there are secret codes in the Bible, these numerology buffs, where it's not just good enough that the Bible says something. The Bible also has to have these secret codes. And if you're really in tune with the Holy Spirit and you're really studying to show yourself approved, you could find God's real secret message. In fact, in this time period, there were some people who thought that this secret message was more important than the original message. These were like real divine gnosis that you're getting from the text here.
I wonder if anybody ever found a so-called secret message that they didn't like, that was bad news, or is it always something that confirms what they want to be true?
Well, that's the thing, is typically the communities that are involved in this type of interpretive model are trying to write about their current time period, right? They're not necessarily always doing it for the future. Not saying, well, because of this is what we should expect in the future. They're actually saying, no. This already happened, but you know what? When we look back at these texts over here, it was predicted They told us this was going to happen. So it's like a self-reinforcing phenomenon where you can then go out to the people and say, look at all these things that were in the Hebrew Bible, and look at all these things happening today. This must be the hand of God. And people who don't know any better, like, oh yeah, God did have a secret plan all along, didn't he?
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen people talk about how you can find helicopters in the book of Revelation, This
Right.
is obviously talking about an Apache helicopter.
Yeah, it is the case. Unfortunately, when I was a new Christian, this was the type of stuff that I was introduced to in terms of like Bible prophecy. It took me until I was like getting ready to go to Bible college that I figured out, like, actually, if you really read these, they have nothing to do with like these popular like Tim LaHaye type of viewpoints.
Mhm. Another thing in the Psalms, Psalm 41, verse 9, where now to me, when I read this, I thought it was talking about Ahithophel, David's
Ahithophel, yeah.
David's advisor who defected to Absalom.
Right, yeah.
Is that correct? Or is because of course the prophecy is supposed to be that this is referring to Judas, right?
That's, yeah, in John, Jesus says, I believe John 13:18, Jesus says, I know the one whom I've chosen. And he says, it is to fulfill the scripture. And then he quotes verse 9, the one who ate of my bread, my close friend whom I trusted, has lifted the heel against me. Now, the problem, which you've already pointed out, one is it's a Psalm of David. I mean, David's the one who's speaking. It's probably about Ahithophel. It's hard to know exactly because David doesn't give as many details as you would like in a lot of his writings, but it certainly could have been about Ahithophel. Nevertheless, the problem that you have here is if you, as you said, look at the context, it's clearly not a prophecy and it's clearly not about Jesus. It says in verse 4, as for me, I said, O Lord, be gracious to me, heal me, for I've sinned against you. Wait, what? My enemies wonder in malice when I will die and my name perish, so on and so forth. This is obviously a psalm of lamentation from a sinner, from someone like King David. So when he gets to verse 9, even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate of my bread, has lifted the heel against me. Listen, there's not a single reason I can think of to look at this single verse out of the whole chapter and be like, that one verse, that one there is a hidden prophecy, despite the fact that none of the context would point towards it.
Yeah, Jesus would have to be a sinner.
Right.
It's just, I don't get why people are compelled by that. Like you cherry pick this verse out because it has someone betraying someone else, because that's what happened in Jesus. As if, I mean, every single person on earth has probably felt betrayed by somebody at some point. Of course, there's stories about it. And obviously, this is David and not Jesus, and this is referring to a situation he was in and not Jesus. But people pull this verse out and say, this is a fulfilled prophecy, one of 300. The odds are astronomical that they could all be fulfilled. This proves the Bible is true. But you look into it, you just go individually. All right, let's look at these prophecies. And it's like, what are you talking about? This is not a fulfilled prophecy.
No, and the funny part is these are not even prophecies, like just from the start. So like when you do hermeneutics, your very first hermeneutics class, you're going to say, listen, there's a couple of things you got to pay attention to. One is genre, one is context, and then you need what is going on in the author's life that would help you to understand their words, and what's going on in the audience's life that would help you understand how they would interpret those words. And so, but when we look at these prophecies, we're like, okay, we have to ignore all of that. We don't care what David meant. We don't care what his audience would have heard. We don't care what the context is. And we absolutely don't care about the genre. Every method of hermeneutic is completely trashed the minute you start talking about the prophecies of Jesus.
But the something like the book of Daniel would have to be considered prophecy, right?
Daniel absolutely is prophecy.
But written after, like it's written as if these events haven't happened yet. But when it was written, those events had already happened. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And that's why people think it's ironclad fulfilled prophecy.
Like 90% of those events had already happened. And So the part where you can figure out where it was written is when they get to the death of Antiochus. It's clear that they're writing during the Antiochian crisis, but they actually get the death and the location and the manner of death wrong. So obviously they weren't writing after that. They must have been writing before that period, but after the invasion of Jerusalem by Antiochus. And this is not a new view. Early as Porphyry of Tyre, they were pointing this out, that obviously Daniel was a forgery. It wasn't written by a guy named Daniel during the Babylonian period, because look, he knows everything about the 2nd century. He nails it. But when we get to this period of Antiochus dying, we're like, wait a minute, he just flubs it. How could that be?
Yeah.
And so it's obviously written as a apocalyptic literature, trying to tell the Jewish people during the Antiochian crisis, don't worry, your salvation's just around the corner. The promises of God are just moments away. Hold on just a little bit longer. And if you read Second Maccabees, you'll see a little bit of that post-Antiochian situation where they start to feel like, oh, this is coming true. In fact, in Second Maccabees, at one point, there's a prologue to a letter that says, the promises of God have now started coming true and are soon to all be fulfilled. They understood this period as to maybe be the fulfillment of what was written in the book of Daniel, which is why Daniel had so much staying power, because the Hasmonean dynasty was pretty damn strong. In fact, we've got some coins from that time period where we've got rulers like Alexander Jannaeus, I believe, was the first one that literally had like a messianic iconography on the coin, perhaps even suggesting that they're in the Messianic period as described in the book of Numbers, which is where this Messianic star seems to come from in the prophecies. And so the book of Daniel had staying power because it did look like finally God's people won. And the Antiochian crisis was dealt with. And you know what? That means we're on the up and up. The problem that you have is once Rome comes in and devastates the Hasmonean stronghold, well, now you're like, what do we do with this? And the Christians are like, obviously it wasn't about that. It was about our guy, Jesus, because look at this. If you interpret it just right and you ignore everything that we know it's actually about, you can pigeonhole Jesus into some of this. Like Daniel chapter 9 is probably the most famous. And it seems pretty clear that Jesus thought that he was the Son of Man from Daniel chapter 7. This seems pretty obvious. And this concept of a Son of Man is even further compounded by 2nd Esdras and the book of Enoch, where the Son of Man gets associated with the Messiah. And although it's clear that it's actually just one of the archangels in the book of Daniel. But if you read Daniel 9, like maybe the most famous prophecy about Jesus from Daniel, it's so clearly about the Antiochian crisis to me. Every time I read this with a Christian, I'm baffled that they can walk away from this text and still think it has anything to do with Jesus, because they tell you at the beginning of the chapter what the 490 years is all about. They start reading at verse 24, but at the very beginning of the chapter, Daniel gets the vision, and he's clearly asking about the prophecy from Jeremiah, namely the 70 years. Why haven't the promises come true? Right? So he's literally praying about 522. So just after the 70 years have basically expired, and figuring out like, hey, those promises in Jeremiah didn't seem to all come true yet. What's given? What's the problem? And so he figures out, oh, actually, it turns out there's this curse in the law of Moses. Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 has it, where if God punishes us and we don't return to him, then our punishment will be multiplied by 7. So our punishment, the devastation time for Jerusalem, is 70 times 7, 490 years. Well, that's the right way to read it. But the problem is the devastation of Jerusalem started in 605 when Nebuchadnezzar rolled into town, which is subsequently when Jeremiah wrote the prophecy. And so if you're starting 490 years from 605, it's really interesting. It gets you right into the middle of the 2nd century.
So when you have Daniel crossing over from history to prophecy, but he's writing the whole thing like prophecy, it lends a lot of credibility to him. Like he was right about all these things. So then when you hit that point where it's no longer history and he's predicting things, people are like, this ironclad, this is going to happen because he was right about all this other stuff all along, right?
Yeah.
But then it doesn't. Let me throw you
Mhm.
one. Let's see, Psalm 69, verse 21.
That's another good
They
one
put
that Jesus quotes. Yeah.
So how about that? They put gall in my. Let's see. They put gall in my food and gave me vinegar for my thirsts.
Yeah. So Psalm 69 gets quoted, I want to say 3 different times as being a prophecy about Jesus. In fact, I think twice alone it comes up in the book of John. Let me grab those references because I actually have those specific prophecies from the book of John written down here. So in Psalm 69, we find a reference in Matthew referring to the righteous sufferer. That's Psalm 69:21, which is one you're referring to. We find another
Mm-hmm.
reference to Psalm 69:9 in John 2:17. And then there's
Mm-hmm.
another reference to the same psalm in John 15:25, and that's referring to Psalm 69:4, possibly. And
Mm-hmm.
then one more in John 19, we have another reference to Psalm 69:21. So Psalm 69, there's a lot of material there that people think are going to be about Jesus. And the one that you brought up, they gave me poison for food, and for my thirst, they gave me vinegar to drink. Well, listen, this is kind of what you would expect. This is going to be another psalm of lament, right? So, if David is writing about his struggles, and it starts out to the leader, meaning the leader of the choir,
Mm-hmm.
according to the Lilies, which is one of their songs. So they had standard songs. You could give like a psalm, like a lyric list, and they would say, do this according to this music, right? So you would pair the lyrics with music. And believe it or not, back in like early hymnals, they would do that. They would have just lyric lists and they would say, pair this with this music. And then there'd be a number going to a music sheet. That's kind of how this would work.
Mm-hmm.
And it says, this is of David. So David wrote this. And it starts out, save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. Oh, this is clearly David. There's no prophecy to be had here. This is just another one of those situations where, because something sounds like Jesus, we're just going to say, well, it must be a prophecy. But how many people have been given poison for food and vinegar to drink? Every person who's ever been crucified just about by the Romans have had some version of this happen to them. It's one of the most common occurrences you're ever going to find. And then Psalm 69:4 is really interesting. It says, more in number than the hairs of my head are those who hate me without cause. Okay. Well, who who hasn't been hated? What a weird callback to a prophecy. Yeah, we know people get hated a lot. That doesn't mean you're fulfilling a prophecy in a psalm that's not really even prophetic. So
Mm-hmm.
you were talking about earlier vague prophecies where they're so
Right.
vague. You're like, how would we be able to apply this? This is another one of those instances. And even verse 9 gets brought up. Jesus brings this one up. He says, it is zeal for your house that consumes me. Okay, interesting. So Jesus can quote Psalm 9, but like, why? Why do we care that Jesus quoted one verse in Psalm 69? Now it becomes a prophecy. That's circular. Is saying, listen, these prophecies become prophecies because my guy said they're prophecies. Okay, well,
Yeah.
why would she believe your guy? Oh, because he fulfilled the prophecies. No. We have to determine that they're real prophecies before you get to say he fulfilled them. But that's kind of the game, right? They're prophecies because my book said so. And because they said so, that means they're actual prophecies and Jesus got to fulfill them all.
Yeah. What surprised me, like Jesus even talks about how he's fulfilling prophecies, right? Like, what was it? Isaiah 61, verse 1. So
Yeah.
Jesus is reading from this scroll of Isaiah, saying that he will set the captives free,
Right. The Spirit of the Lord is
And
upon me. A pretty famous quotation from Luke 4.
right, Luke 4, verse 16 through 21, and he's basically saying that, well, I'm fulfilling this prophecy, mic drop, right? And that's I don't get that. Like, in the context of the prophecy, it says that there will be no more mourning or despair, right? And where is it? Verse 3.
Yeah. For verse 2 and verse 3, we get some interesting restoration language, and it carries on into verse 4. I think verse 4 is kind of the smoking gun for interpreting this.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah, it's talking about no more mourning or despair, but instead joy and praise. And I noticed that a lot of the times Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10 is thrown at me as a prophecy. And the context for that is the complete opposite. It says how all of Israel will have tremendous grieving and mourning.
Right.
And it's interesting, these two are both prophecies, and they're both considered prophecies, but they're both giving completely opposite outcomes.
Right.
How does that make sense? How do they reconcile that?
It's tough. So as you probably already noticed, when Jesus quotes this, it's funny because he quotes this from the Greek, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
In the Hebrew, you'll notice there's a line missing. So you don't see anything in here about, let me grab the verse from Luke chapter 4. There's one verse that doesn't show up in Isaiah 61 that Jesus includes inside of his quotation, because it does show up in the Greek, but it doesn't show up in the Hebrew. But also, the ordering is different. When Jesus reads it from the scroll, the verses are out of order compared to all the Greek Septuagint manuscripts that we have. So it says here, recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed. Well, this is interesting. So we've got captives, blind, and oppressed. When you go to Isaiah 61, you've got oppressed, brokenhearted, liberty to the captives, and prisoners. Where's the blind people? Oh, they're not there. We just wanted to include that. Well, obviously they would want to include that part from the reading of the Greek, because what was one of Jesus's most famous things? Well, healing of the blind. And so you have to pick and choose which version you're even using, just to make sure you get the one that you like best. But on top of it, they stop right here. They stop at release to the prisoners. Well, or year of the Lord's favor, sorry. But this is literally one sentence: proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God. That would have been one full sentence. So he cut it off in the middle of a sentence because he didn't want to also quote the rest of it, the day of vengeance of our God. Well, vengeance for what? Who's being venged? Well, it's the Babylonians. If you read all of Isaiah, God's putting vengeance on the Babylonians when he brings his people back from captivity, which is why, as you pointed out, the very next verse is to provide for those who mourn in Zion, to give them garland instead of ashings. Well, why were they mourning in Zion? Oh, because the Babylonians devastated them. They burned down their cities. Yeah. They kidnapped their children and carried them away into captivity. Jeremiah 31:15 literally says so. And that's why verse 4, they shall build up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up the devastations of former times. They shall repair the ruined cities and the devastations of many generations. This is clearly a prophecy of physical restoration for the Israelite people, which means Jesus, if he didn't do any of this, then he's obviously not the person in verse 1 where it says the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. And also, to be sure, the me is the person speaking. It's the prophet. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed. Well, who's delivering the message to the oppressed? It's the author of this exact chapter. So there's no good reason to put Jesus in here once you read the context and understand what was happening in the author's lifetime, in the audience's lifetime, and what the actual requirements were.
Yeah, it's wild to think about Jesus stopping in the middle of a verse, right? Or leaving out the rest of the sentence, because that kind of gives up the game. It makes you think of like tactics like that coming from a creationist on YouTube, not Jesus.
Right. It's embarrassing wild, too, because here's what you have to do as a Christian to know whether or not this prophecy was fulfilled. You just have to go to Isaiah and read it. That's it. That's all you had to do. Go back and read 5 verses and you would know what's happening here. But Christians won't do it. They'll read the New Testament. Well, Jesus said he did it, so he must have done it. Okay. Did you bother reading the source material?
Right. Okay. Now this one I'm a little more familiar with all the shenanigans, but it's important to point out anyway. It's because this is a big one that a lot of people turn to, and that's Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14.
Yeah.
About how Jesus will be born of a virgin. So what's the deal there? Obviously, this proves it.
This is the smoking gun. Obviously, this is about Jesus. It's funny, a lot of the debate on this topic on Isaiah 7:14 is around the Hebrew wording Alma, but you could actually grant, well, you shouldn't because it doesn't match the language, but you could theoretically grant that the original translation or the original version said virgin. A virgin shall conceive. Okay. Virgins do conceive, right? My own brother married a virgin who got pregnant literally on their honeymoon. A virgin conceived. And so a virgin conceiving is not the same as a virgin giving birth. Those are very different things. So if the prophecy was originally something akin to, look, the virgin shall conceive, dope. I'm not impressed yet. Well, why would he say something so unimpressive? Oh, because the rest of the prophecy is obviously not about the child necessarily. The child is not as important as what God is doing with the child, namely using that child as a timeline. And so if you go back in the passage, verse 1 and 2 kind of lay out the situation. King Ahaz, the king of Judah, is under attack, and the northern Israelites made an alliance with the Arameans, and they're going to team up and try to take over the Judean throne and put somebody on the throne that's more favorable to their alliance, and Ahaz is terrified, as you would expect. So God sends the prophet Isaiah to go speak to him. First time, he ends his first prophecy with, if you do not stand firm in faith, you shall not stand at all. So God's like, hey, we need you to stay strong, buddy. We're going to get through this, right? So then the very next thing he does says, again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz, saying, ask a sign of the Lord your God, and let it be as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. Okay, so he's like, listen, I need you to have faith. Ask for a sign so I can show you something. But Ahaz, because he is kind of a wicked king, played fake piety and said, I will not ask and I will not put the Lord to the test. Then Isaiah said, Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary mortals that you weary my God also? So Isaiah's like, listen, buddy, you're wearing God's patience pretty thin. So he says, therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel. Now, this is where you can pause for a minute. It's clearly about a pregnant young woman. In Hebrew, it says ha'alma, which means a pregnant young woman. So ha'alma just means the woman or the young woman, and hara would be an adjective for pregnant. She's clearly already pregnant, and she's shortly probably going to be giving birth. So that's one thing in the Hebrew text that is super problematic for the interpretation. The other problem is it's actually pretty clear that the name Emmanuel is a prophetic name. If you read the rest of 7 and 8, those chapters, all of Isaiah's children have prophetic names. And in the end of chapter 8, he even says that the children that you've given to me who are signs, meaning these children are prophetic signs, for the future. So this would seem to be in agreement with chapter 8, which is namely, this child is probably the child of Isaiah and his wife, the prophetess. And this child is doing the same thing that is described in chapter 8. Namely, he's going to be a timeline. So it says, he shall eat curds and honey by the time he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land before, whose 2 kings you are in dread, will be deserted. Okay, well, how's that going to happen? The Lord will bring on you and on your people and on your ancestral house such days as have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, the king of Assyria. So he's saying, listen, the child is about to be born. Before that child knows right from wrong, so about age 13, before that child knows right from wrong, I'm going to send the king of Assyria, and the king of Assyria is going to wipe out those 2 kings that you're afraid of. And if you simply just turn the page, that's what happens. In chapter 8, we find another child who is acting as a timeline for the same event. It says, before the child knows how to call my mother or my father, the wealth of Damascus, that's the principal city of the Arameans, which was subsequently taken a couple times from Samaria, and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away by the king of Assyria. So again, we've got a child acting as a timeline for when the king of Assyria is going to come in and do what he needs to do. And then the very next section is depicting that thing occur. It says, It will sweep, meaning the floodwaters of the armies. It will sweep on into Judah as a flood, and pouring over, it will reach up to the neck, and its outspread wings will fill the breadth of your land. This is where it gets fun. Will fill your land. O Emmanuel, take notice, you people, and be dismayed. Listen, you far off countries, gird yourselves and be dismayed. Take counsel together, but it shall be brought to naught. Speak a word, but it shall not stand, for God is with us, which again is Emmanuel. And it's interesting, if you look at the Hebrew manuscripts, they section this out differently than the English. The English, you'll see, wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel, period. That's not true in most of the Hebrew manuscripts. The wings will fill the breadth of your land, and then you've got a section that begins and ends with Emmanuel. Emmanuel, take notice, you people. So what is Emmanuel supposed to be doing for us in this section? It's clearly the promise. God is with us. God promised, I would be with you in this war. I promised that I would give you what you need to survive this war. I gave you signs to shore up your faith, that I am with you in this war. Emmanuel is a reference to God being with his people during the war, which is why the prophet says it twice. As the war is taking place, he literally says that they won't succeed against Judah, even though they're going to wipe out the northerners. They won't succeed against Judah because God is with us. Says it twice. So there's not a good reason to look at this and say, actually, this is a prophecy for 730 years later about a guy named Jesus who, pretended or was told that he was born of a virgin mother. None of that fits the context of this passage. That has nothing to do with what the prophet's doing here.
What do you think about the rest of the prophecies? And there's a bunch of prophecies in Isaiah, alleged prophecies.
A bunch, yeah.
Isaiah 9, chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. Jesus's ministry starts in Galilee.
Yeah, right? I really like Isaiah 9. It's a fun one. And again, all you have to do to figure it out is read the text. But I think you know that they're not reading the text. Let me show you something really interesting in Isaiah 9, though. So you will notice that Isaiah 9, the beginning, is brought up when Jesus moves to Galilee. And the rest of it, the part that Christians really love, it talks about a child born to us, none of that gets quoted in the New Testament. What a weird thing to have such a strong prophecy about Jesus that doesn't get quoted in the New Testament. We'll touch on that, why that is the case here in a second. But if you open up verse 9, or chapter 9, it's actually pretty clear what's happening. So this, you have to remember Isaiah, the first Isaiah, not second or third Isaiah, the ones who came after Isaiah died, was writing mostly during the Assyrian period, when the Assyrian conquest was happening during the time of King Hezekiah, and there were multiple incursions. There's the first incursion didn't necessarily wipe out all the northerners. It took a couple times of the army coming back around to finish the job. Now, what we find, though, is there was a period where there was a really difficult incursion where it looked like they basically were going to wipe out all the north, and then maybe even wipe out Judea. And it turns out that they couldn't take Jerusalem. We find this later in Isaiah. We'll see that also in Kings. So they couldn't take Jerusalem, and they still had more work to do in the north. And after this invasion, people were very convinced that God had given them rest from the Assyrians, because it was a long time, maybe another decade before they came back. So there's a lot of stuff happening in this time period that they thought, God has preserved some of us from the hands of the Assyrians. And that seems to be about when this was written. And there's a lot I can say about that. I'm actually working on a book detailing all of these prophecies in their original context. And I've got a lot to say about the context of this one that would be too much for this. But in the future, maybe we can do a deep dive on this particular chapter. But this was obviously written at a time period where the northern tribes weren't completely wiped out yet, and the Assyrians were off fighting other battles, and they hadn't come back to finish the job. It says, there will be no gloom for those who are in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. Those are the northernmost countries or territories next to Dan, where the Assyrians came in at. They always come in from the northeast. And it says, but in the latter time, he will make glorious the way of the sea, which is about the same territory, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. Okay, cool. So he's saying, listen, your shame came through Galilee, essentially. These armies came through and, they punked you. But in latter times, these same territories are actually going to be glorious. God's going to restore them, right? And it says the people, he's going to tell you why. The people who walked in darkness, this past tense now, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. So what you'll notice is you're saying, listen, these people were walking in darkness. Now they're in a great light. Well, why would that be? Oh, because the Assyrians came through and destroyed them. But look, things are better now. We're on the upswing. We've got a new king getting ready to take the throne, or perhaps just being born. And things are looking up. They don't know the Assyrians are coming back. Those who lived in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shined. You have multiplied exaltation. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as people exult when dividing plunder, which is interesting because none of this actually happened when Jesus was in Galilee. This is not stuff that happened. And they certainly weren't dividing plunder. They are getting plundered heavily by the Romans. It says, but when they were able to chase off the Assyrians for a time period, certainly there would have been some plunder being divided. It says, for the yoke of their burden and the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressors, you have broken as in the day of Midian's, referring to the Assyrians. You've broken the rod of these oppressors. In fact, the Babylonian Talmud and some of the later interpreters, like Rashi and the like, talk about Isaiah 9 in the same context that I'm going to give you here, which is namely, this is in the middle of the Assyrian conquest period. But verse 5, for the boots of the trampling warriors and all the garments rolled in blood shall be burned as fuel for the fire, meaning the wars are over. All these bloody garments, throw them in the fire. We're done. We're going to be done with this. But why? Right? Verse 6, for a child has been born for us. Now, this is where Christians should really pay attention to the text, and also where knowing Hebrew helps. So my translation just says, for a child has been born for us. And well, in English, we understand what that means. For is a way of saying because, but I think in modern day English, it gives you more force when you just say because. Because if you say that the garments rolled in blood shall be burned as fuel for the fire because a child has been born for us, well, now your brain is connecting. Oh, these events in verse 5 are occurring because of verse 6. Well, in verse 6, there's a child that's already been born. It's clearly going to be a king. It's probably Hezekiah. And it says, a son has been given to us. These are actually in the past tense. So both Yeled, the verb for bearing a child in verse 6, and Natan, the verb for giving, both of them are in the past tense. This is a child that's already been born at the time of writing, which you would expect if it's about Hezekiah in the middle of the Assyrian period. It says, authority rests upon his shoulders, and he is named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Great will be his authority, and there shall be endless peace for the throne of David and his kingdom. He will establish and uphold it with justice and righteousness from this time onward forevermore, so on and so forth. So this is clearly about a real king who's actually going to sit on the throne of David, which is something that King Hezekiah did. And Christians were like, yes, but they called him Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Well, this is where, again, knowing a little bit of Hebrew helps, and also knowing ancient context. And the ancient enthronement psalms and prophecies, they would give these theophoric names to their leaders. It doesn't mean that they thought their leader literally was God. That's not really what it meant. It means that they're giving names that are attributive of their God, but also is that mantle will be upheld by the king. The king is there to uphold the mantle of making sure that the God is receiving, this appropriate worship and attribute. And so what you would find in the ancient literature is when, like, especially in Egypt, they had a formula, typically 4 or 5 theophoric names in a row, and then ending in something akin to everlasting enthronement, everlasting life, a very common formula. And you can find it throughout Near Eastern literature. It's pretty common. So this is what we would expect to find if we've got an enthronement prophecy for a new king, especially a king who a lot of hope is resting upon and who went down with great fame. Hezekiah is one of the most famous good kings of the Hebrew Bible. You would expect this prophecy to be preserved. Now, the weirdest thing is, if this is really about Jesus, we would expect that this is something that the New Testament should have touched on, but it doesn't. And the reason is because Again, they couldn't read Hebrew. They were reading Greek. And in the Greek version of this passage, it reads very different. In fact, let me grab, this is Isaiah 9:1. Let me grab Isaiah 9:6 in the Septuagint. In verse 6 for the Greek, it says something completely different. It says, because a child was born for us, a son also given to us, whose sovereignty was upon his shoulder. He is named messenger of great counsel, for I will bring peace upon the rulers and peace and health to him. Oh, this again sounds just like an enthronement prophecy, because it is. That's what it is. They use different theophoric names, different elements in this particular version, but it's essentially the same thing. They're just saying, hey, there's a new king, a child's been born, is going to be awesome. He's going to have a long life. God's going to bless him. And that's all that's happening here. That's the only thing that's happening in this chapter. And unfortunately for Christians, if they read the Greek Septuagint, which is what the New Testament authors were doing, they would have saw why the New Testament authors didn't think it was about Jesus.
And Isaiah has a couple more that where the context to me seems very unfulfilled, and that would be Isaiah 11 and Isaiah 35.
Oh yeah.
In Isaiah 11, it's Jesus will draw the Gentiles to himself, and in Isaiah 35, it's about him performing miraculous healings. But if you look at the context of those, that seems very unfulfilled. It's like you have this surgical precision where you take this little bit out that seems fulfilled and you ignore the surrounding context.
Yes, 100%. And in Isaiah 11, this is like a really traditionally messianic interpreted passage. If you want to know, hey, if you talk to a typical Jew and you talk to them about what do we expect the Messiah to do, they're going to take you to Isaiah 11, Micah chapter 4, and quite a few others, Jeremiah 33, so on and so forth. And they're going to point to all this stuff: world peace, no more war anymore. The wolf will lie down with the lamb, so on and so forth. And then all the remnant of Israel and Judah will return. Ezekiel 36, Ezekiel 37, all the same stuff. Well, listen, Jesus didn't do any of that. Not a single thing. So when the New Testament says that Jesus fulfilled a prophecy because he was called a Nazarene, which is a play on words, perhaps with Isaiah 11, where it says a branch shall grow out of its roots, meaning it's a netzer in Hebrew, which is vaguely familiar to the word Nazareth in the first century. This is the weakest possible prophetic link I've ever heard in my life. It's the biggest cope I've ever seen someone do to try to tie a real messianic passage to Jesus. He didn't do a single thing in the entire chapter, but you know what? The town that he lived in sounded vaguely familiar to a word in verse 1. That's how bad they're reaching.
Yeah, that is funny. And don't they do some more gymnastics to make it oh gosh, what was it? Hosea 11, where he's coming out of Egypt.
Yeah,
but they have to. It seems like they have to shift Jesus's life to fulfill things that aren't really prophecies, right?
Yeah, for sure. And Hosea 11 to me is maybe, I want to say it's one of the most stark examples of what I'm going to say is the author Matthew being purposely deceptive. And for example, Matthew chapter 2 says that he got up and took the child and his mother by night and went to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. And in order to, fulfill the prophecy, out of Egypt I've called my son, so on and so forth. Okay, so we would expect that there is a legitimate prophecy in Hosea about this. This is the only book that has this quotation, except there's a similar one in Exodus 4. But when you read it, you're like, okay, it's interesting. There's a prophecy here. It starts in verse 5. So maybe we have a legitimate prophecy. Okay, so you go to verse 1 and it says, when Israel was a child, I loved him. Well, that's past tense. So what's happening here? It says, out of Egypt I called my son. Oh, this is the Exodus. The more I called them, the more they went from me. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and offering incense to idols. Yeah, this is the Exodus period, for sure. And then God says, yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. And so now he's saying, listen, I brought my firstborn child out of Egypt. I taught them how to walk, just like a good father. And then he's like, but they abandoned me. And because of that, I'm going to ruin their lives. I'm sending them back to Egypt, and Assyria is going to be their king, and so on and so forth. So first 4 verses are actually preambles. They're not prophecies. It's a preamble for why God is about to give you this punishment. There's no prophecy in verse 1. And again, the wild thing is, this is one of the few prophecies, one of the only prophecies in the New Testament where they purposely quoted it in the Hebrew rather than the Greek, even though everything else is in the Greek. And the reason why they did that is because if you read it in the Greek, it's really funny. It comes out to, out of Egypt, I called back his children in the plural, because the author knew that this was about the Israelites, not about a future son of God. And so they couldn't say that. This is one time where actually the Greek is not helping us here. We have to use the Hebrew. And it's clear in the Hebrew is talking about the Israelites, because in Exodus 4:22, God says, it says, thus you shall say to Pharaoh, thus saith the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. Yeah, that's why when talking about the Exodus, it talks about the God's firstborn son, because Israel is the firstborn son, not Jesus.
Right. Talk about dying for a lie. I mean, clearly they knew what they were doing. When you're hunting for, if you're, nowadays we have 100 different Bible translations, and if one isn't fitting your narrative but another one is, and that's the only time you cite that one, I mean, you're being kind of dishonest there.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much what they were doing. And when I read it, it's clear to me that it's referring to Israel. So they come up with this whole story about how Jesus had to go to Egypt, but the history isn't really there, is it? About the reason for why.
Yeah, and it's very contradictory. So, for example, in Matthew, you've got Jesus going right into Egypt. But if you read the other gospel, Luke, with the infancy, he actually, there's no timeline you can do where he ends up going to Egypt and coming out. It's clear that they go from Bethlehem to the temple to the north. So there's no flight into Egypt, and it can't fit the timeline in Luke. So this seems to be like one of two things. Either he did go to Egypt and the author of Luke didn't know about it, or he didn't go to Egypt and they needed to invent something to make him seem similar to Moses. Because one of the shticks that you'll find in Matthew is they're painting Jesus as like another Moses. And so actually, we can really paint Jesus to be like Moses if he comes out of Egypt, and we'll just attribute, Hosea 11 to him. But the problem is the timeline can't match up with Luke. And the most egregious problem with this timeline, and I'm a little bit shocked that Christians don't know about this one, because when I was a Christian, I knew about it. And I wasn't, as a young Christian, I wasn't the type of person that was like going around just looking for these contradictions. At one point when I became a young adult, I started to, because I was like, hey, we should examine this. But this was pretty common. It says later, when Herod died, so this is obviously Herod the Great, which we'll figure out here in another verse. When Herod died, the angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, get up and take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who were seeking the child's life are dead. Then Joseph got up and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Okay, so the setting in Matthew is Archelaus is ruling when they come out. That means this is obviously Herod the Great. Herod the Great is the one who fathered Archelaus, and Herod the Great died in 4 BCE. Okay, so cool. That means Jesus, according to Matthew, had to have been born prior to 4 BCE. Now, personally, I think Jesus probably was in Egypt for about 2 years. It's not an important feature, but it's something to think about. So he was either born between 4 and 6 BCE. And then in Luke, though, we get a really different timeline. It says at the beginning of Luke, In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration and was taken while Quirinius was governor in Syria. Oh, that's a problem, because Jesus is born in the middle of the census. The census happened around 6 CE, and even if you want to squabble about the exact date of the census, it's actually pretty clear that there's a huge gap of about 10 years, because Quirinius didn't take governorship until Archelaus was deposed. So Archelaus, who took over for his father Herod, was already in office and then deposed before Quirinius took over, which means if Jesus was born during the census or the governorship of Quirinius, he could not have been born prior to the death of Herod. That just simply is impossible. So the fact that the infancy gospels have so much that can't be reconciled, to me, is super problematic, because now it's like, listen, if you're going to invent some prophecies for somebody, we could see why you would do that. But now it's like, you're not just inventing prophecies, you're inventing a whole infancy story and then tying prophecies, invented prophecies, to an invented infancy story.
People think about the modern era, and I think relate it too much to the ancient world, where, we have all kinds of resources and everybody's literate, and we have all kinds of sources and things that we can look up and go to the library, go online on the internet. Back then, when they were writing this stuff, I mean, we were talking about decades after the fact, at least, right? And they don't have access to all these records, and they're kind of like spitballing, coming up with timelines and stuff that don't really work, but they don't know that. And the people who read them don't know that too. It's not something that you can just type into a website and check it out, and verify it for yourself.
True. Yeah. And you've heard Christians say, well, like, if these problems were so obvious in the text, how come the early church and the people didn't catch them? Like, well, they actually kind of did. They wrote about quite a few of them. The problem is they did apologetics. They wrote stuff to, like, well, if you squint really hard and make this say this and change this word to that, you can find a way to massage the text enough to do it. So, like, these problems are pretty well known.
By jumping to Hosea, I skipped over an important one, and that's Isaiah 53. All
Maybe
about
the most.
Jesus's life, suffering, persecution, death, burial. Supposedly that's all in Isaiah 53. So boom, owned, gotcha,
cooked. Sorry, I gotta retire now. I'm done.
Yeah.
Isaiah 53 is an interesting one, because the goal of the Christian is to latch on to maybe the ambiguity of the chapter. It starts technically in 52. And if you're only reading it out of context, it's really ambiguous. And you can absolutely see why somebody would get confused reading it. You're like, well, what's happening here? It seems to be about a person. However, if you go back to the beginning of the unit, so most scholars have put the beginning of the unit about chapter 40. Chapter 40 starts out this idea of God is saying, if your term of service for your crimes, the sins that you've committed, are done. You can leave Babylon now. You've been given double for your sins. I've punished you twice. And so he's like, it's time to get restored. It's time to go back home. I'm going to glorify you. And then all the nations are going to see how cool I am because I've glorified you. And all the kings of the nations will come running to you, bringing their wealth to you, and so on and so forth. And so right at the beginning of the chapter, you would expect, or beginning of the section, you would expect maybe some information that could help you understand who the servant is. And if you look, it actually is there on 9 different occasions at least. The author of this section tells you who the servant is. In 41:8-9, he says, "But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I've chosen, the offspring of Abraham, my friend, you who I took from the ends of the earth and called from its furthest corners, saying to you, you are my servant. I have chosen you and not cast you off." This is really interesting, because now when you get to chapter 53 and 52, and the Christian says, hey, but servant is singular, him and he is singular. Yeah, that's what happens. That's how metaphors work. If you're saying this group of people is my servant, then you could refer to that servant in the singular because you used a singular word. But keep in mind, if Israel is my servant, he's now using a singular to refer to a collective, which is super obvious in the next passage, 43:10. You are my witnesses, that's obviously plural, says the Lord, and my servant whom I've chosen. So he couldn't be more clear. There's a plurality of people who are being personified as a singular servant. And then he does it again in 44:1 and 2. Hear now, O Jacob, my servant, and Israel, whom I've chosen. And then 44:21. Remember these things, O Jacob and Israel, for you are my servant. I formed you. You are my servant. 45:4. For the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel, my chosen, I call you by your name. And then not the last one, but maybe my favorite one, because I think it kind of lays the groundwork for chapter 52 and 53. It says, go out from Babylon, flee from Chaldea, declare this with a shout of joy and proclaim it. Send it forth to the ends of the earth and say that the Lord has redeemed his servant Jacob. Well, the whole crux of this unit is about the redemption of God's servant Jacob. The whole thing, the chapter 40 to 55, all of it is about the redemption of his servant from the Babylonian captivity. So when you get to chapter 52 and chapter 53, there's really no good reason to add in a different servant, especially when he told you who the servant is. And he kind of tells you who's speaking as well. In 52, he says, the Lord has bared his holy arm before the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. Well, in the same chapter, he tells you what the salvation means. Salvation is freedom from exile, which is why he says, the very next line, depart, go out from there. Touch no unclean thing, go out from the midst of it and purify yourselves. You who carry the vessels of the Lord, for you shall not go out in haste, and you shall not go out in flight. For the Lord your God will go before you, and the God of Israel will be your rear guard, which is hearkening back again to the Exodus, because they're about to make another Exodus. But he's saying this time, you don't have to rush. God's got your back. And then the very next line, after he is telling his servant it's time to go, he says, see, my servant shall prosper. Yeah, we would expect that. You've said it 10 times already. He shall be exalted and lifted up, shall be very high. Just as there were many who were astonished at him, so marred was his appearance beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of mortals. So he shall startle many nations, and kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which had not been told to them they shall see, and that which they had not heard they shall contemplate, which all lines up with the rest of Isaiah, where God says that these kings who witness your redemption will come running to you. That's the goal. And we find it in Zechariah. It shows up in Zechariah chapter 8 as well. And so he says, listen, these kings, these nations, that which they did not hear, they're going to see. Okay, well, that's the redemption that he's been talking about. That which they have not heard about, they're going to contemplate. They're going to contemplate it because they're about to witness it. So the very next line is a personification of the nations contemplating exactly that. Who has believed our report or what we have heard, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Okay, so obviously, if these are the nations speaking, they're speaking about past events. Who has believed what we have heard? All of this is in the past tense. This is talking about the nations describing what they did to Israel and then the subsequent events of God freeing them from captivity. And they start out with, to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Well, we already know, verse 10. The arm of the Lord has been revealed to the nations. That's why the nations here are the ones speaking, saying that the arm of the Lord has been revealed to us. For he grew up before him like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. Honestly, this is another one. If you had read the rest of Isaiah, you'd know. God personifies Israel on 2 other occasions after this as being a plant, a shoot, a tree that he planted in the ground. And so again, we see it in 53 personifying Israel. And he had no form or majesty that we would look upon him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. Yeah, this is all characteristic of what God says about the nation of Israel. He didn't pick Israel because they were the mightiest or they were the greatest. In fact, in Jeremiah, he says that they were like a wallowing, bloody prostitute on the side of the road when he found them. And so, this is pretty part and parcel. And so what we've got here is a description of the nations after they've witnessed the vindication of Israel, saying, oh my gosh, who would believe what we have witnessed? This servant who we thought God had abandoned, we thought that they were nobody. God has done this amazing, wonderful work. Well, why would this happen? And verse 4 starts to explain it. Well, this has happened because now we are being brought to Yahweh. We, the nations, now have been brought to the one true God, and we get to worship in the new Jerusalem. We get to participate. Chapter 56 says that the foreigners who participate in the worship of Yahweh and obey his Sabbath will bring their sacrifices to the same altar that the Israelites bring their sacrifices to. So this is literal. The suffering of the Israelites literally is supposed to be leading to the salvation of the nations who are witnessing God's mighty and wondrous deeds, just like he did in Egypt when he says, they will see my deeds and they will know that I am the Lord. That's the goal here, which is why we see more near the end of it where he says some pretty telling stuff that certainly wouldn't be about Jesus, but certainly would be about Israel. It says, it was the will of the Lord to crush him with affliction. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days, and through him the will of the Lord will prosper. Well, that's interesting because Jesus didn't have any offspring, and Christians will say, we're Jesus' offspring. No, you're not. You're Jesus' siblings. The New Testament explicitly says that we are joint heirs with Jesus. Heirs are siblings. They're not children. We're not children of Jesus. We're children of Jesus' father, the same way he's a child. So this can't be Jesus' offspring. And it says that his days will be prolonged. That certainly was something promised to Israel. Didn't happen to Jesus. And then even more telling, in verse 12, it says, I will allot him a portion with the great, referring to land, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, referring to war spoil. Okay, this is interesting. This is really intriguing because Jesus didn't go to war. He didn't win any wars. He certainly didn't allot any spoil from his enemies or divide the land of the enemies. This is clearly in line with the promises made to Israel that God is going to allow all the nations to serve. In fact, chapter 60, God says all the nations who do not serve Israel will be wiped out. And so this is honestly, it's so easy to interpret if you've just read all of Isaiah.
Yeah, it seems like it would be really easy to become a great Christian apologist if you just believe that the Bible doesn't say what it actually says.
Yeah.
And just make it say something completely different.
Yeah. If you just know the context, it's really not that hard. The problem is, the Christians are not encouraged to read the Hebrew Bible. They're encouraged to read the New Testament, to love Jesus, and then pretend like the Old Testament is just for somebody, another time period.
Or like I've heard others say to you, that the King James Version is the ultimate true 100% flawless version that in existence. I've heard people say that to you.
I do get tickled with the King James onlyists, only because to me it's funny. It's the equivalent of, like, you ever see people who go to the doctor and they're convinced that they have to tell the doctor what the real problem is, like the doctor can't figure it out, despite the fact that they don't have any medical training. This is every King James onlyist you've ever met. They have never studied the original languages. They don't know anything about the manuscripts, but somehow they know that every person who has translated these texts are wrong and they're right. It's wild.
Going back to the first part, that's the beginning of that section you were talking about in Isaiah 40. There's another one in there, and Isaiah 40 verses 3 through 5, which is supposed to be referring to John the Baptist. It's predicting John the Baptist. What's that about?
Yeah, this is really fun. Okay, so the New Testament doesn't know what to do with John the Baptist. In fact, famously, John himself denied being a couple different things. He denied being Elijah, even though Jesus says he is Elijah. He denied being the prophet, meaning the return of Moses. But he did say, I am the one whose voice is crying out. Now, so what's happening here in chapter 40 is kind of what we talked about. This is the beginning of the section where God says it's time to leave Babylon. You're done. He says, comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that she has served her term, that her penalty is paid, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for her sins. A voice cries out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Well, where are they going? Oh, obviously they're returning to the homeland, right? Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, every mountain and hill shall be made low, the uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Well, there's a couple of problems here. One is all flesh didn't see it, the glory of the Lord. That certainly didn't happen. It certainly isn't true that Jesus prepared anyone to return back to the homeland. In fact, after Jesus, they just got further chased out of the homeland. And the application of this, first of all, we already went over the context. The context is getting out of Babylon. But the application of this in Mark, to me, is super fascinating. And the other Gospels fix it, like Matthew, when they quote this passage, fix Mark's blunder. But in Mark, it says, in the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, as it is written in the prophet Isaiah, and then he says, see, I'm sending my messenger ahead of you who prepare your way. The voice of the one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his paths. Wait a minute. This is the one we saw in Isaiah, but what's this? That's not in Isaiah. This is a completely different quote. That's from Malachi. That's Malachi chapter 3. He confused Malachi chapter 3 with Isaiah chapter 40 because they sounded similar, and Mark didn't have the wherewithal to realize he was making a mistake, and he says, written in the prophet Isaiah. And which is why later the gospel authors that copied from Mark had to correct it, and they got rid of Isaiah and just wrote prophets, or they just cut out the part that was misplaced. And so it's intriguing that like even when they're calling back to these passages, trying to tie them in somewhere, they're just making blunders over and over again because they're really not that familiar with the Hebrew Bible. Like they've obviously heard the passages, they know some passages, but they're not really going through it with a fine-tooth comb.
Right. They don't have access to every version written like we do.
Right. Yeah.
And that's one of the things that amazes me is how people can say that there's no mistakes in the Bible. It's all like, that's one of the miracles, is that it's all perfect, even though all these different people wrote it across all these different time periods. And I mean, look, you have gospel writers misquoting the scripture, and others coming in and copying, but leaving out the Isaiah reference, or not Isaiah. I'm sorry.
Malachi,
well, no, yeah. Right. And it just goes to show, look, these people weren't inspired by some perfect divine being who made sure they got it all right. They got all kinds of stuff wrong.
Yeah. There's a really big blunder too in Matthew, should be 27. So in Matthew 27:9, I believe. Yeah. And this is one you've maybe heard me bring this up because it's kind of fun when you get a Christian who really thinks that the gospel authors knew the prophecies. This is again about Jesus's betrayal. And it says, then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. And then the quote comes, and they took 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one on whom a price had been set, on whom some of the people of Israel had set a price, and they gave them for the potter's field as the Lord commanded me. Well, but just by reading this, I would expect that in Jeremiah, I would find this quote, and I would find a prophecy about Jesus being betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. You won't find either. So this quote here, right up to the word price, that actually comes from Zechariah. That has nothing to do with Jeremiah. Jeremiah didn't say that. And if you go to Zechariah where that shows up, chapter 11, if I remember correctly,
right?
Doesn't
verses 12 through 13.
Yeah, exactly. There's no Messiah in there. There's no one getting betrayed in there. It's literally, there's two worthless shepherds. It's a prophecy about worthless shepherds. So if this is about Jesus, that would mean Jesus is a worthless shepherd. And the other part, verse 10, is kind of a loose reference to Jeremiah. Jeremiah at one point does go and buy a potter's field. The problem is he's paid 30 pieces of silver. That's not what he paid for it. So it's just weird that we've got these two references to Jesus's betrayal when neither one of them are quoted properly and neither one of them have anything to do with the Messiah being betrayed, because whoever's writing this, they just don't know what they're doing, or they're intentionally trying to deceive people.
Right. And speaking of going back to Jesus's whole childhood and the manipulations that had to occur for that to allegedly, fulfill prophecies that they thought needed to be fulfilled. Micah chapter 5, verse 2, Jesus will be born in Bethlehem. So they had to find a way to get Jesus in Bethlehem with that census, right?
Mm-hmm. And so, like, the interesting thing is, and this is one thing I will admit that my interpretation, while it's held by a lot of scholars, it's not universally accepted. But I think as I explain it to you, it'll make a lot of sense. But whether you accept my interpretation of the very first line or not, it's still, you'll see it's not about Jesus. But it says, "You, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel, whose origin is from old, from ancient days." Cool. So we can read more. If you read more, it's obviously clearly not about Jesus. But we don't even need to read more to know that it's not. The first line says, Bethlehem of Ephrathah. Now, I'm going to read this, and I'm saying these are probably referring to the ancestors of King David, not necessarily the cities. Now, Bethlehem and Ephrathah, or Ephrath, were both cities. At one point, they became synonymous with each other. Bethlehem and Ephrath were basically confused to be the same place. But the reason why these towns existed is because they were named after these ancestors. They were named after these two people. And so you'll find these in the book of Chronicles. And so the next line makes more sense, where it says, "Who are of the little clans of Judah?" Because while Bethlehem is a town, it might not be classified as a clan. However, if we're interpreting this as ancestors of David, then it becomes a clan. So my reading of this is he's not referring to specifically the location of this person's birth, but to the lineage of the person's birth, which is super important because it says, "From you shall come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel, whose origin is from old, from ancient days." Okay, so this would definitely be like, hey, this person's lineage is from ancient days, all the way back to the eldest ancestors of King David. This is not about the city of Bethlehem. And the other problem is it's clearly about a physical ruler of the Davidic line, one who is to rule in Israel, which, as we know, Jesus never did. Not for 1 minute did he rule in Israel. And then if you keep reading, it just gets worse for Jesus. It says, "Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has brought forth. Then the rest of his kindred shall return to the people of Israel." Oh, this is a return of the Israelites. They didn't return to the land. And it says, "He shall stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God." Well, this is interesting because now it's saying that Yahweh is this person's God, which would never work if the Trinity is true. If Jesus actually is God, you can't say that Yahweh is Jesus' God. That would put Jesus on a different level than Yahweh. So nothing in here can really be applied to Jesus. They're just wanting to take the word Bethlehem and say, "Oh, there, we got it. He was born in Bethlehem. We got a prophecy."
So could it be that Jesus was born in Nazareth and they think they needed this as a prophecy, so they found a way to get him into Bethlehem?
Yeah, that's my take on it. The really interesting irony is there actually is a northern Bethlehem. There's two of them. And so I often wonder myself, maybe he had some relation to the northern Bethlehem, but then they thought maybe we can utilize this for prophetic purposes if we make sure he's at the other Bethlehem. And that certainly is a possibility. But my personal opinion, I think he was actually from Nazareth. We find him in extra biblical texts as always being referred to as Jesus of Nazareth. Even in the Bible, he's referred to as Jesus of Nazareth. His sect of followers inside and outside of the Bible are typically referred to as Galileans, which would be affiliated with Nazareth. And so it seems like the whole movement was based out of not where Bethlehem would be located, but out of where Nazareth would have been located. So if history tells us anything, it seems like he probably was a Nazarene, probably born and raised around Galilee and Nazareth. And they needed to utilize Bethlehem as some kind of fulfilled prophecy. So they filled in a little bit of narrative to make sure he found a way to get to Bethlehem. And then we've got this convoluted, contradictory story about him being in Bethlehem that doesn't match the other infancy stories.
Right, right. Okay, but I do have one that you've never heard before and will convert you on the spot. You're not going to have an answer for it. And that will be Zechariah 9:9, Jesus entering Jerusalem on a donkey. Bam, proven,
Cooked.
ironclad prophecy. Yeah.
You know what? I might have to hang it up after this. This is another one of those interesting prophecies from Zechariah. Zechariah is fun because so much of what he wrote was short, and it seemed to have been collected after he was probably already dead, and it was kind of haphazardly assembled. You can't really follow a narrative, but we do have one interesting part that talks about like people in war that are going to be essentially saved. So you can see that in verse 8, right? It says, "No oppressor shall again rule over them or overrun them. For now I have seen with my own eyes." And then it says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. He will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off. And he shall command peace to the nations, and his dominion shall be from sea to sea, from the river to the ends of the earth." This is actually quite intriguing because, you know, Christians are just going to quote this part and be like, well, he did ride the donkey. And it's funny, when I first started streaming, I would kind of tongue in cheek just say, Jesus only fulfilled one prophecy. And then I would point them to this one. Well, listen, he did ride the donkey, but it's a worthless prophecy. But in reality, he actually didn't fulfill this prophecy. This prophecy is not about a dude riding a donkey. It's about an actual legitimate king who's getting victory over his enemies. This is why it says he's going to cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem and the battle bow. So he's like, listen, these weapons of war, they're going to be done away with. Your enemies are going to be subdued. And this king is going to be the victorious one who does it. And so the fact that Jesus, first of all, wasn't a king, he certainly wasn't victorious over Israel's enemies, would lead you to conclude that this can't be about Jesus. And so this is where Christians invent a new type of prophecy where they say it's not typology, it's not a double fulfillment. This is partial fulfillment, meaning the part that we like, the donkey part, he fulfilled that. The other parts he'll fill when he comes back. But isn't it convenient that when we get these partially fulfilled prophecies, the only part that gets fulfilled is like the mundane stuff that you and I have probably already done? Like, I've ridden a donkey. That doesn't mean that I partially fulfilled this prophecy. It just means that none of us have fulfilled this prophecy.
What now? I'm just thinking off the cuff here. What is? Isn't there some confusion about him riding two donkeys simultaneously? What's that about?
Yeah. Okay, so this is true, and in Matthew, and again, Matthew doesn't seem to have a good grasp on grammar and language. And this funny thing happens in Hebrew. You've got synonymous parallelism, where sometimes it'll kind of restate the same thing twice. And it's not to think that it's being doubled, it's just parallelism. It's a poetic device that was very common in Semitic languages. You'll see it a ton in the ancient Akkadian, especially Sumerian. And it says, humble, riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Well, Matthew is interpreting this as two donkeys. He's like, wait a minute, there's two donkeys in here. In order for Jesus to be fulfilling this, we got to have two donkeys. And so in Matthew's account, in Matthew 21, there are literally two donkeys, and it looks to me like Jesus is mounting both of them. Question has to be asked, how does that happen? Is he planking across them? Has he got like a leg on each one? Did he do like the Jean-Claude Van Damme split? We don't know. What we do know is there are two.
I like to think of the idea of them telling Jesus he has to do this to fulfill prophecy. They're misreading it, so they're getting poor Jesus onto these two donkeys, trying to straddle both of them at the same time.
This is pretty wild. If you go to the passage, let's see, it says they brought the donkey and the colt and put their cloaks on them, and he sat on them. So he's sat on two donkeys, it looks like. Well, pretty wild.
Yeah. Quite the funny misunderstanding that results in someone having to do stunts. And of course, there's one more about being pierced and that would be Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10. And that is another one where I think that the context seems very, very much unfulfilled.
Yeah.
But they just like the part about Jesus being pierced.
The word, you hear one key word, and all of a sudden they're like, it's Jesus. I heard the magic word. I heard pierced. Now, this actually does say pierced. You find the word dakar in the text. Zechariah 12:10 really does have it. So it literally is referring to someone who is either pierced literally or metaphorically, depending on who you think it is. We can discuss the who, but I actually don't think the who is very important to figure out what's happening here. And in fact, chapter 12 and chapter 14 are a little bit duplicates of each other. They're both describing this final battle before like the end time. And if you read chapter 14 in unison with chapter 12, you'll discover that it's actually impossible to be about Jesus. So if you read 12, though, we get the war, right? It says it will be against Judah and also the siege against Jerusalem. And then God talks about how it's going to be a horrible siege, but you know what? He's going to grant them victory. The inhabitants of Jerusalem have strength through the Lord of hosts, their God. On that day, I will make the clans of Judah like a blazing pot. So listen, this is obviously what Revelation would refer to as Armageddon. This is the final battle where God defeats all of the nations that rise up against Jerusalem, which we'll see again in chapter 14, and gives Jerusalem the victory. So it says, on that day, I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem, and I will pour out a spirit of compassion and supplication on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that when they look upon the one whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one who mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps over a firstborn. On that day, the mourning in Jerusalem will be as great as the mourning for Hadad Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo, and the land shall mourn each family by itself, the family of the house of David by itself, and their wives themselves, the family of the house of Nathan, and so on and so forth. And it's starting to name the ancestral families. So this is really interesting. If you believe that this is about the future, meaning Armageddon, then you're going to interpret this passage and say, this is about what happens after Armageddon. The Jews who rejected Jesus are going to look upon the one whom they have pierced and mourn. And if I was a Christian, that's the way I would like to interpret it. The problem that you're going to have is in the Gospel of John, he makes that very difficult. In John 19, he seems to imply that the prophecy is fulfilled by the Roman centurions. And so if you go down to right after he's crucified, and then they have to take him off the cross, and they're about to break his legs, and then they pierce him with the spear on the side. It says, instead, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once blood and water came out. He who saw this has testified, so that you may also believe. His testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth, so that you may also continue to believe. These things occurred so that the scripture might be fulfilled. So he's saying the scripture needs to be fulfilled, which is why the centurion did this. And that scripture is, none of his bones shall be broken. That's a quote from Exodus 12. That's not a prophecy. That's Passover instructions. And then the next one, it says, and again, another passage of scripture says, they will look upon the one whom they have pierced. Oh, so he's interpreting this as the centurions looking upon the one whom they have pierced. This is a fulfillment of Zechariah when the centurions do it. So that makes the interpretation of like the post-Armageddon a little bit difficult. It's not impossible, but it makes it a little bit more difficult. Now, the thing that makes it impossible for Jesus is a couple things. One, because this would contradict what we find in the rest of Scripture, namely that the Jews, when the final battle is over, the Jews are going to go into a deep, deep mourning over a Messiah. That doesn't exist anywhere in the scriptures. Now, you could say, and this is one reason that a lot of Jews are divided on the interpretation. They think this could be one of the battle leaders that dies in battle, and they're mourning over him. In fact, if you read the Talmud, there's a section, I believe in Sukkot, where it even talks about how there's probably two messiahs and one of them dies in battle, and they reference this passage here. And then there's an alternative interpretation where it's literally just a metaphor, and believe it or not, this metaphor shows up in the Hebrew Bible elsewhere. where when it talks about piercing, it says whom they have pierced. They're referring to like a piercing of the heart. It's kind of like saying you hurt me, but when I say that, I mean emotionally. You hurt me emotionally, right? This is actually this word shows up in the Hebrew Bible also to refer to this exact thing. So this certainly could be referring to how the Jews who were disobedient to the Lord had pierced the Lord, essentially through the heart, through their disobedience, and now they're repenting because the Lord, even though they have pierced the Lord, they are now being vindicated by the Lord. That's one possible reading, and I think that's the best reading given what we find in chapter 14, which is another rendition of the war. And so at the end of this rendition of the war, it gets really, really interesting. It says, all who survive of the nations that have come against Jerusalem shall go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the festival of booths. Oh, interesting. So after the war, the foreigners are going to be doing Mosaic rituals? It says, if any of the families of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain upon them. And if the family of Egypt do not go up to present themselves, there will be no rain for them. And there will be there will be the plague that the Lord inflicts on the nations that do not go up to keep the festival of booths. And such shall be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations that do not go up to keep the festival of booths. And then even defines sacrifices that they're going to have to give. On that day, there shall be inscribed on the bells of the horses, holy to the Lord, and the cooking pots in the house of the Lord shall be as holy as the bowls in front of the altar. And every cooking pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall be holy to the Lord of hosts, so that all who sacrifice may come and use them to boil the flesh of the sacrifice. Oh, interesting. So it seems to me that the foreigners are going to join the Israelites giving legitimate Mosaic sacrifices after this final battle. This could not be about Jesus. If Jesus was, in fact, the final sacrifice, this is a direct contradiction of that.
Right. Interesting. But it's not convenient, so you don't have to get into all that. Just stick to the part about how he was pierced.
Right. The pierced, right. Just that one line is what you need to focus on. Just ignore the rest of the context.
Yeah. So in the old days, like when first starting on YouTube, the joke was that, oh, theists are going to tell you you're taking it out of context. Maybe Non-Stamp Collector even made a great animation called Context. But the reality is the perfect opposite.
Yeah.
It's they're taking a lot of shit out of context in order to get these prophecies to work in their favor. And even if they could, it would be, oh, a guy got pierced. I mean, it's the ancient world. A lot of people got pierced.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. That's why you've got interpretations from the Jews. Are like, oh yeah, this is a guy who fell in battle. It's what you would expect. It's a war, buddy.
And what I get from discussing this is that people really ought to pay more attention to if something is written in the past tense versus saying this will happen. Because when the Bible says this will happen, that's more of a prophecy, like a legitimate prophecy that they're trying to convey. But when they're talking about something in the past tense, forget about it. It's not making a prediction.
Right.
And that seems like a really simple thing to wrap your head around, unless you're trying to manipulate the text to support your belief system.
Right. And that's the goal. With these prophecies, it wasn't that they read them and were convinced. They were convinced of the message of Jesus prior to knowing these passages. They were convinced of Jesus, and then they went back into the book and say, what can we find that would demonstrate our conclusion to be true? And this was the best they could come up with, and it's not good.
Right. Yeah. It baffles me as to how people can be convinced by it, but they are.
Well,
and I would even have doubt that a lot of people are convinced by it, but like given some people that I know who are believers, that I know are sincere about it, I can't be dismissive. I have to accept that they really believe this stuff, even though it's not that compelling to me, and it's a mystery to me.
Well, I think reading reading the Hebrew Bible is hard. And so I'll give you, when I was 22, I think, the summer I turned 23, I had read quite a bit of the Bible. Obviously, the New Testament. I'd been a Christian for a while. I'd read most of the Old Testament, but when it came to historical books and some of the prophets, it was very difficult. I decided one summer I was going to read through 1st and 2nd Kings, and it took me all summer because I didn't know the names, I didn't know the geography. There was so much I had to learn. And so when you're reading, you're trying to go back and read through some of these Old Testament prophets. You can see why a Christian would pick it up and say, I don't know what any of this stuff is. I don't know who these people are. I don't know where these territories are. And you can see why they'd be like, listen, I just prefer the Gospel of John. I am the light. We get that. That's fantastic, right? So I think it's kind of a factor of laziness. The Bible says you have to study to show yourself approved, and Christians are like, yeah, I'd rather let the pastor tell me what to think.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, given the way people handle things, nowadays, we're kind of like cordoned off into different filter bubbles where, people get their news from one source or this and that. They listen to specific people. They let the algorithm feed them a bunch of stuff that they've curated. And it's, you can kind of see how people work in that way, where they get used to certain things being true and you don't really question it anymore. And there's a bunch of stuff that they haven't even thought of or looked into or discovered. And it's kind of frustrating to try to introduce it to them because they already, quote unquote, know. They don't need you telling them anything. They know already. So you can't tell them.
I think one of the hard things is if you were raised in a religion, or if you had like a radical conversion experience, or if you were raised in a church where they taught you to expect signs and wonders, and then you thought that you saw some of those things, it could be very difficult to convince them that the things that they saw with their own eyes actually aren't real, right? No matter what the Bible says, they're like, well, I saw it with my own eyes, And that's a powerful thing to have, to say, I went to a church service, and you know what? This woman in the wheelchair got up and started walking. And that's why these televangelists do that type of stuff, because they know that'll hook them. It doesn't matter what's in the Bible after that point. You've hooked them. They're yours.
Yeah. Yeah. Are there any other major prophecies that I'm missing that you would want to mention? What, any that you get all the time?
I think one of the ones that I've been getting a lot recently, and I don't know if I used to not talk about it as much because I don't know, I thought genealogy was boring, but it's actually kind of important. And there's some prophecies that everybody knows about. The prophecies that the Messiah is supposed to be from the line of David, and Jesus obviously was from the line of David. Come on. Well, unfortunately, that's not the case. So if you look into the lineage that we get for David, and for Jesus, they don't line up. We were not going to get Jesus into the line of David. And it seems to suggest in 2 Samuel 7 and in Psalm 89 that the Messiah is supposed to come through the seed of David. So it says, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom, and he shall build a house for a name. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Okay, so this forever throne is coming through somebody who's coming from the physical body and seed of David, which means the genealogies in Matthew 1 and Luke chapter 3 are just right out, because in Matthew 1, it goes to Joseph. Joseph is not the father of Jesus. He's an adopted father at best, but if that's his father, he didn't come from the seed of David. He was adopted into the family of somebody who might have come from the seed of David. And even worse, it goes through Jeconiah. Jeconiah is listed as the last person in the lineage prior to the deportation into Babylon. And you would know in Jeremiah 22:30, God curses Jeconiah and says that none of his offspring will succeed in sitting on the throne of King David ever again. And they didn't. And so that's a huge problem. And then you're like, well, yeah, but Luke gets you to the line of David because obviously it goes to Mary. Well, it doesn't. It doesn't go to Mary. Not only does it not go to Mary, it doesn't go through Solomon. The line has to go through David, through Solomon, through the body and the physical lineage. But it goes through Nathan, the son of David, Nathan, which wasn't promised the throne at all. And so that's the first problem. But the second problem is if you go down to verse 23, it says Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his work, and he was the son, as was thought, of Joseph, son of Heli, son of Mathat. Oh, Joseph, the son of Heli. That's interesting. Neither one of these lineages get you to the line of David, because this is not for Mary, it's for Joseph again. Both of these lineages are for Joseph. Jesus has no connection to the line of David whatsoever. And Mary, as far as we can tell, is a Levite. It says that her cousin Elizabeth was of the daughters of Aaron, which would mean that if they're cousins, they were both of the daughters of Aaron, unless they're only related by marriage, which I find hard to believe that they would be referring to each other as cousin if they're only related by marriage. And so it seems to me that Mary was probably a Levite, and Jesus's real father was probably a Roman centurion, which is why a lot of the extra biblical literature refer to Jesus as Yeshua ben Pentera, would be Jesus, son of Pentera, who is the famous name of the Roman soldier that probably got Mary knocked up while she was betrothed to another man, which is why they had to escape to Egypt, which is what Celsus would say, one of the earliest critics that was in disputation with the origin.
And how would the apologists account for these discrepancies? What is their argument?
Well, so what will typically happen is if you're in Matthew, what you want to do is say something like, well, it doesn't, when it says physical seed, it doesn't mean all of the ancestry. It just means Solomon. Solomon is the one that came from David's seed and had the throne promised forever. Well, what a weird carve out to think that God wanted the promise to go through the seed of David, but only for one generation. Just one generation of David's seed. And that's not how lineage typically worked. Kingly lineage in the ancient times was not through adoption. It was through your physical seed, because it was believed that, your actual genetics had a divine component. So that's what they would have understood this passage to mean, which is, the seed is going to carry on all the way until you get to this messianic figure. So Matthew, the only way to square it is say, well, it was good enough that Jesus was adopted into the lineage, and that at least you can go through Solomon in this case rather than through Nathan, but it can't fix the issue with Jeconiah. What they'll say with Jeconiah is actually God forgave and eliminated the curse of Jeconiah, because after the deportation of Babylon, Zerubbabel, who was related to Jeconiah, came after Jeconiah, he was the first governor of the returned exiles. But as you'll read carefully, he was a governor, he was never a king. He never sat on a throne. He was never anointed king. And also, it would contradict Numbers 23:19 and 1 Samuel 15:29, where it says that God is not a human, that he would change his mind, nor a mortal that he would lie, or I might have got lie and change mind flipped. But two famous passages, God doesn't change his mind. So if God said, all of your lineage, Jeconiah, is cursed, they'll never sit on the throne, and then later God's like, I didn't really mean it. Well, now you've got another contradiction to deal with. Does he change his mind or does he not change his mind? And so that's a huge problem in Matthew. And in Psalm 89, God says, I will not violate my covenant or alter the word that went forth from my lips. Once and for all, I have sworn by my holiness, I will not lie to David. His line shall continue forever, and his throne endure before me like the sun. It shall be established forever like the moon. Now, when it says line, it's seed, it's referring to his physical seed. So if his physical seed is being established forever, along with his throne, it would stand to reason that it's the physical seed of David that will be on the physical throne that's being preserved in the covenant.
One of the arguments that I hear is that, if you think people haven't thought of these contradictions before. You're the first one to find out that there's a contradiction, and a lot of times the conversation will end there, and it won't really elaborate. You know, uh, they're kind of relying on the apologists to not even to argue for them, but just to exist. You know, like there's people that disagree with you. That's good enough for me. End of discussion. You know,
Right.
I've had that happen to me quite a bit.
Well, I think if you're a Christian, and this is my experience in Christianity, is you're trained in the church that people who don't believe it the same as you, the people who are critical of the Bible and critical of the faith, well, they're bad. Like they're angry at God, they don't like Christians, and therefore you can't trust them. So you have to stick to teachers, resources, books that are trustworthy. The content
Yeah.
isn't as important as to whether or not the source is trustworthy. And so they're trained to not really critically analyze the content. They're trained to just pick sources that they think are good. And then as long as the source is good, they assume that the material is good. But that's not how that works, unfortunately. And so when
Right.
it comes to like contradictions, someone like you and I would be like, hey, here's a contradiction. And they're like, well, yeah, but this guy over here that I trust says it's not a contradiction. And then they won't even look into it because they've already been trained that we can't be trusted. We're evil. Satan has blinded us. But this guy over here, Pastor, what's his face? Well, he loves God, so he must be trustworthy. And all the while, they'll never once even look into the actual subject to see, hey, well, maybe somebody's wrong and maybe somebody's right. We'd actually look at the evidence rather than just trusting somebody blindly.
Yeah, they kind of almost legitimize or try to reconcile in their head, you know, that the ad hominem fallacy, where, you know, they've established that there's something wrong with you, so no matter what you say, it's tainted. Uh, you know, I've been accused of you know, working for the devil, or you know, I secretly really do believe, but I'm mad at God. Like you said, they have all these excuses. Um, Something bad happened to me,
You just
or
want to
you
sin.
know, right. Just want to sin. I mean, never mind that my life is completely boring, and then I live a life that probably looks more Christ-like than most Christians. You know, I'm married and a dad, and I'm just a boring guy. But that's another thing that I just remembered was I was watching one of your streams, and I usually catch them afterwards after they've been recorded, and this guy, he starts going after your kid. Do you
Yeah.
remember? Like, that's wild to me. Like, I have a kid who is a nonverbal autistic kid,
hmm
and I got the impression that yours is as well.
hmm
And so these kids, I mean, they're just young, sweet, innocent children,
Yeah.
and he goes after them like this is a punishment from God, like your kid is a punishment from God or something like that. And it's like that blows my mind on several levels. One, that someone could be, you know, just rotten enough to do that. This is supposed to be someone who thinks they have the moral high ground, just rotten enough to do something like that. And also that they would believe in a God that would do that and think that that God is good. Like they they don't. That's why one of the reasons I say that some of these people lack the ability to morally reason.
hmm
You know, they're not just coming up with reasons for why rape and murder are sometimes justified, you know, as it is in the Bible, but also that they can, you know, go after a little kid, like a little autistic kid, and think that they're on the right side.
It's pretty gruesome. I've had 3 different occasions, if I'm counting correctly. One of them, 2 of them are recorded. One of them was from a long time ago. But on 3 different
Mhm,
occasions, I've had, and it's usually people who want to do dumb philosophical discussions, like they're not really good at actually reading the Bible. And
mhm.
when their syllogism doesn't work, they get mad and they say something like, you know, you're a retard just like your son. And boy, if you want to see the comment section pop the fuck off, when somebody says something like that, they lose their mind. Then for good reason. It's one of the most vile things you can say. Child, a child cannot control their genetic boundaries. Like they were given that. And so demeaning a child by calling them a slur because they were born in particular ways, the craziest thing you could even, it'd be different if someone said like, actually, Justin, you're a retard. But that's one thing. You can call me the R word all day. It's stupid. You shouldn't be using it. But like, I'm an adult, but like, at what point do we need to bring children into it? I'm so confused why children have anything to do with why you hate me. And so it's baffling to me that these same people are the ones who think that we're the immoral people because we don't believe in their God who rapes women and genocides entire people groups.
Yeah. Yep. And you know, I don't get that. It's alien to me.
How old's your child?
He is 14 now.
Okay.
14. And you know, he's just such a sweet kid, you know, very good-natured, very sweet, gentle, and happy.
Yeah.
And you know, people they people who would see that as my punishment, it's just so absurd. He's been nothing but a joy in my life.
Right. Yeah, my son is much the same. Everyone who meets him thinks he's just a sweet, delightful boy, and he is. And it's you know, it comes with certain challenges for sure. But he's happy. You know what I mean? Like it's crazy.
Sometimes I think that people with a neurotypical child have it harder. You know, like I sometimes I think about what would the pressures of having a neurotypical 14-year-old be? Maybe he's getting in trouble with the police, or maybe he knocked up some girl. Or, you know, so there's all kinds of ridiculous levels of drama that could be happening in my life right now that aren't. But you know, when people start bringing in your life, they've already lost the argument. They're just looking for reasons to justify their own beliefs, to write you off. That's the main thing I think they're trying to do, is anything they can to write you off. And it's a lot harder to do that with you because you know what you're talking about. You know it better than they do. And they have to reconcile that. You know, they have to come up with a way to make that okay in their head. You know, you're working for the devil.
Yeah.
You're cursed.
It's hard because if you're a Christian and you find yourself in a debate with someone with a formal education, the reality is you don't have a lot of tools in your toolbox. You're going to be repeating stuff you heard from apologists, which, to be sure, most apologists aren't educated. There's only a very few of them that are educated, like William Lane Craig or Sean McDowell. Most of them aren't educated. And even Sean McDowell got his PhD in literally apologetics, a worthless degree. And so there's not too many of them out there. And most people that are doing these debates, you know, they're not real well educated, and they just heard the talking points and they thought, well, if I repeat these talking points, it'll work. Because it worked when I saw this guy. He was convincing to me. And so they get frustrated when they come into my live stream because they expected these talking points to work. They were told that these were good talking points. And then when they don't work, they don't know what to do with themselves. Either they melt, sometimes they become honest, and sometimes they rage. And sometimes I feel bad for them. Sometimes they come in and you can tell that like there's a wave rushing over them of like, oh no, the things that I've been told actually just aren't true. And those are actually the hardest conversations, when you can hear in their voice like that sound of disappointment and despair. And you want to reach out and kind of hug them and let them know, like, it's going to be okay. We were, you know, I was in your shoes once before, and that's hard to witness.
Yeah, there is definitely a big gradient where some of them, you almost feel bad that you're saying this stuff, and even though you 100%, you know, stand by it. But then there's others who are just obscenely arrogant. You know nothing, they know everything. You're an idiot. And I can't feel bad about that. That at that point you kind of just kind of use them for a vehicle for the audience to teach the audience something. And you're never gonna. Well, I mean, I shouldn't say you're never gonna convince them, because and a lot of times people like that have been convinced. It's just that they won't do it on camera right then and there. It's a process that'll people say debate doesn't work and all that, but it does. It's not obvious because it doesn't happen before your eyes right then and there. Or like one of those movies, what is it, God's Not Dead or whatever,
Yeah.
where everything's all dramatic and you proved your point then and there definitively and everyone knows it. It's not like that,
Right.
So yeah, it's much less dramatic and happens behind the scenes.
I do get emails from I would say people that were either watching me or have debated me. And I'll definitely get some callers that will find my email address afterwards and be like, you know what? I thought about the stuff that we talked about, and I looked for better answers since I couldn't come up with anything while we were talking. And he's like, I got nothing. There's no good answers. And so I've had quite a few people talk about how they've started their deconstruction process, but I think one of the hard things though is like a lot of times you'll get that initial email from them, or like, and then you never get a follow up. You never hear from them like 2 years later to see where they ended up. But I am really lucky that I do get some feedback from the people that come through my live stream, and I would say that there's definitely a movement of people coming to the realization that it's all nonsense more in this like period in history than I would have thought 10 or 15 years ago. I think people are pretty open to learning new things right now, especially because we're kind of in a golden age of like biblical scholarship right now, especially with all the data that's available and all the people with high level PhD degrees in the field with nowhere to teach because the theological schools are completely full. And so now they're just writing books, academic works.
Speaking of which, what is the status of your book? Do you know what it'll be called and when it'll be ready?
Yeah, so the name and cover art is already. I did that some while ago. I'm hoping to get it finished this year. I really actually need to get it be finished before November, so I can have something ready for pre-order before Christmas. That'd be the ideal scenario. Some of the bigger parts, like the more difficult parts of the book, are already done. I'm detailing each of the prophecies as they show up in the Gospels, and
I think that'll be a very valuable resource.
Yeah,
that's what inspired me to want to do this collab with you. And so this book will be very useful to a lot of people.
I hope so. The book is going to go into a lot more detail than what I ever get to during the streams, because I can actually show a lot of documentation and resources. And I get to go into some of the translation difficulties that's hard to do while you're live streaming, and demonstrate like, hey, here's an instance where Matthew is purposely changing a pronoun because he wants it to sound more like Jesus's life. Whereas even in the Greek that he copied from, it's not the same pronoun. And so you get to do some of that kind of cool stuff, which makes it much more interesting. So I do get a breakdown of the ancient manuscripts in Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic, and kind of show like how the New Testament authors tweaked them, how they toyed with them to get to their, version of it. And so we get to do some fun stuff like that. And then each chapter, the end of the chapter, I do like a full exegetical breakdown of that particular passage from the Old Testament, trying to inform the reader, this is what is actually happening. Like, if it's not about Jesus, what is it? Well, this is actually what it is. So I spend a good deal of time doing like proper exegesis of these Old Testament passages within each chapter. And
do you have a title yet?
Yeah, it's called Unfulfilled. And it'll be volume 1. I like simple one-word titles. People remember them really easy. And I did check to make sure there wasn't another book similar with that name. There's not. So it should be good on naming. And so yeah,
Because
hopefully
people
we'll
will think, because the author thinks you're talking about the book. This book is too unfulfilling, right?
perhaps that might be the
So,
case.
but yeah, it'll be so valuable because for so many people, it's just a foregone conclusion. Jesus fulfilled all these prophecies.
Yeah.
Bam. What do you say to that? And when you look into them, like I brought up a fraction with you just now. I brought up a fraction of the ones that I actually went through because they were so bad. It's like this could be referring to anybody, anything. It's just a mundane thing, and they're calling this a prophecy.
Yeah.
It wasn't even worth me bringing up with you.
It's really bad.
Yeah.
Well, you've seen
Eh,
the list of 350 prophecies of Jesus. Most of them are really bad, just out of context, random quotations. I think the first live stream I ever did on TikTok, I didn't know what I was going to talk about. I didn't even know I was going to be debating. Debating happened later. I was like, you know what? I'm just going to go through this list, and I had 2 or 3 hours to burn, and I went through 100 of the first 300, and it was pretty easy. You can get through a lot of them just with the same principle. Oh, has not even a prophecy. It's about this. Next one.
Yeah. I've heard you tell people not a single prophecy about Jesus has been fulfilled. And, they get shocked. And I can immediately sense the hesitation. They don't want to bring any up. I can immediately sense that. Like they're scared about what you're going to say, or that they're going to look stupid. You clearly know, you say it with such confidence that it's clear that that if they bring up a prophecy, you're going to be familiar with it. So
Yeah.
one of the things I say, and I don't want to claim that this is my own, I might have heard it before, but I just don't remember where, is that when somebody avoids all the cracks on the sidewalk, you can be sure that they can see the cracks on the sidewalk. It's not a coincidence.
Yeah.
So when people start dodging and avoiding and changing the subjects, it's pretty telling to me that they don't have the confidence that they're trying to portray.
Right. Yeah. And it's difficult too, because if you've been told as a Christian that Jesus, for sure, we know for sure he's a Messiah because he's filled all these prophecies. The reality is, if you haven't gone back to read those prophecies, man, you're treading in some difficult waters, because very easily they're going to open up a page and not have any idea what's on it. And so sometimes you get maybe a more honest Christian that will be like, "Oh, I just need to tread lightly here because we're going into uncharted territories." But then you've probably seen, we get some Christians up there that they just know for sure that Jesus fulfilled these prophecies, and they just get hit head first with the book the minute we open one, and they're bewildered. They had no idea that it said what it said. I'm like, how did you not even glance at it before?
And there's people that will flat out admit that they haven't studied the Bible, they haven't read all of the Bible, yet they've committed themselves to it.
Yeah.
And that blows my mind. Like, if I committed my life to something, I would at least read it. At
Sure.
least. But there's all kinds of pressures, familial and societal, that probably affect people. And it's scary. They don't want to be ostracized, maybe.
Well, that was my experience in Christianity. It was kind of cultural, and I came into it like most people did, and I was lucky that when I started deconstructing, and no one gave me a hard time about it. But for a lot of Christians, the minute they start questioning it, they're risking getting kicked out of their house. Their family could disown them. It's a scary place to be.
See, with me, a big part of my inspiration was my brother. I was never a believer, and I always liked to argue about religion. And my brother, he was just, he was kind of like me growing up. He never got into religion at all. But as a young adult, when he was, I think early 20s, he became extremely religious. He converted to Christianity and became extremely religious to where he would try to convert me. He would send me books. I have a lot of these books on my shelves that were from him from way back when, like back in the 90s. And I thought they were so bad, they were like more than a carpenter,
Oh no.
Josh McDowell and
Yeah.
yeah, stuff like that. And they were so convincing to him. But here's what I have a problem with is that my brother's not dumb. He's an aircraft mechanic. He can take an airplane apart and put it back together again. He's a smart guy. Why is he falling for this stuff? That's what that always troubled me, was why do smart people fall for this stuff? And my normal answer would be they're indoctrinated into it. But I can't say that for my brother. He had the same childhood I did.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, if you know the topic only surface deep, it's easy to believe what they say about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you haven't taken the time to really look deeply into it to see where the problems are, then you could be convinced by something. And the claim of Christianity is actually pretty enticing. Like the idea that there's a God that loves you, and hey, if you just like believe in this thing, all your sins will be forgiven and you'll live forever in bliss. It'll be fantastic. And those people that you didn't like, those evil guys over there, they're going to burn forever, right? And so it could be kind of an enticing religion to want to be a part of. And I think that's why it was so popular early on, this idea that eternal life is granted to anyone who believes, not just people that are like specially handpicked by the gods, because, the gods in the first century could, select people to become gods, like Aristeas, or 6 of the various Caesars became deities. But the idea that everybody could live forever, that was very appealing.
And I'm sure they like the idea of their oppressors being punished.
Oh yeah.
Especially in the early days when they had a legitimate claim to oppression, unlike nowadays. But, well, depending on where we're talking about. But back then, I would say they had more of a claim to it.
Well, if you're a Jew in the first century and you've got all these promises from God about all your enemies are going to be defeated, you're going to come back home, you're going to be restored, you can certainly see when it didn't come true, why another story of actually, well, there's a deeper spiritual reality. And when this thing finishes, then it's finally going to happen. You're like, okay, well, it turns out there's a plot twist. It's still going to come true, but it just, it's going to be a little bit different. And that's why we have like the book of Revelation, this idea that like, actually, no, all these promises that Jesus didn't do, when he comes back, he's going to do them. Oh, well, that explains it. Of course.
And what do you say to people who point to the strength of modern day Israel as like a testament to the Bible?
So it's interesting because in modern Israel, they do have a pretty high number of what we would call religious believing Jews. Worldwide, not so much. Worldwide, the majority of Jews, about 50% or more, are atheists. Nevertheless, the thing of it is, there is such a thing as self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think the Jewish people is probably one of those self-fulfilling prophecies. But if you look at what was actually promised to them, well, it didn't match the timeline. And the timeline, like if you go to Ezekiel chapter 12, all the promises of Ezekiel, the new Jerusalem, the new heaven, new earth, new temple, all that stuff, all the people coming back to the land, the Messiah showing up, all that was supposed to happen like within the generation of the post-Babylonian exile. It says that explicitly twice at the end of chapter 12 that these prophecies are not for far off. These are not for distant stays. These are for your generation, O rebellious house. And so if we're really looking at these prophecies, like for what they say, well, it might be great that like Israel survived. Congrats. What a huge achievement that this nation was able to survive so many, millennia of, being downtrodden by other nations. That's pretty phenomenal. But you have to ask yourself, like, okay, well, like, that's great, but none of God's actual promises came true. Like he said at the Isaiah, if you go to Isaiah 54, let me double check. He says in Isaiah 54 that like, I'll never be mad at you or punish you ever again. Let me grab it. I was like, wait, what? And he says this on a couple of different occasions elsewhere. And let's see. Yeah. It says, for a brief moment, I abandoned you, but with great compassion, I will gather you. In overflowing wrath for a moment, I hid my face from you, but with everlasting love, I will have compassion on you, says the Lord, your Redeemer. This is like the days of Noah to me. Just as I swore that the waters of Noah would never again go over the earth, so I have sworn that I will not be angry with you, and I will not rebuke you. For the mountains may depart and the hills be removed, but my steadfast love shall not depart from you, and my covenant of peace shall not be removed. Like, wait a minute. So he's never going to rebuke you or be angry at you, but isn't like the whole shtick of the New Testament is God's like angry at the Jews for not doing what he wanted, and now he had to graft in the Gentiles who was actually going to do his work? And that, what are the Greeks all about? Did the Greeks not represent his anger and punishment? Because it seems, if you read the Maccabees, it seems like what the Greeks did to the Jews was because of God's wrath. So it's very confusing how we can forget all of these very specific promises. And then fast forward, like, well, the Jews are still here and they are in the land. That may be the case, but boy, there's so much that went wrong to get to this point. And I feel like it's like about 40,000 fails for one win.
Yeah, the way they got there in and of itself was, because of their persecution,
Right. True.
So thank you, Justin, for doing this interview. I appreciate it, and it's been very informative, very interesting stuff. And I'm really grateful that there are people like you out there. I say people, but you're really kind of one of a kind. I mean, I don't see many people like you doing this, where you're so knowledgeable, and you're willing to take on anybody that calls in, can talk to you, and I don't think I've seen anyone do a good job of arguing against you regarding the Bible, because you just know what you're talking about, and I thank you for being out there and doing what you do.
I really appreciate you having me, and you're an absolute legend in the game. Those of us that are out doing the debate circuit, no one here is unaware of dark matter. Absolute legend. We appreciate your content as well.
Well, I appreciate it. I feel silly sometimes, like especially the early days when I was just learning how to navigate this space. I feel silly, but I leave that stuff up for posterity, and hopefully my later stuff makes up for it. But yeah, I've been around since 2008 is when I started my channel. So it's been 18 years.
It's a long time.
What's really disheartening is getting messages from people who weren't born until after my channel was started.
That is
yeah,
tough.
I'm getting up there.
We're not going to get any younger.
Yeah. Well, hopefully that becomes you. I mean, you're a better representative than I am. I hope that
you're doing a great job.
Well, thank you. But I hope that you grow and become well known too, which is one of the reasons I'm doing this. Is I want to start, highlighting people who really deserve to be better known than I am, and I think you're one of those people.
Well, I really appreciate that.
All right. Well, hopefully I'll have you on again. We'll find some new topics to discuss.
Sounds great.
Can't wait. I'd enjoy that. Thank you.